About 10 years ago, I moved into a new home in Indiana with 3 roommates. I won't go into too much detail about where the home is located out of respect for my former roommates, one of which still lives there. I will say that it is located in a very old part of town, a few blocks off of one of the very first main roads that used to be in the town that was settled in 1846, I believe. Anyway, this house was definitely not what comes to mind when you picture a haunted house. It was built sometime in the early 80s or early 90s. It was pretty ordinary looking. 3 bedrooms with a small loft area, tiny bathrooms, and not a whole lot of room for 4 adults to spread out. But when you're a college student in your early 20s and have the opportunity to split rent 4 ways, this seemed perfect. We had all our own tiny little spaces, shared a kitchen and living room, and spent most of our time just bullshitting around the dining room table. The house was owned by an older couple who lived in a city about 20 minutes away. They began renting the home out to help finance their retirement. They were sweet, and pretty relaxed on any rules for the home. They told us right off the bat that they were not physically fit enough to do any maintenance or repairs on the house should anything go wrong, so we were told to call them with any issues, and they would send over their handyman, or whichever professional was needed. They never came to the house. Not once. We paid rent by money order through the mail. I didn't find this strange at the time. The first weird event occurred about a week after we all moved in. We all worked the night shift at our respective jobs, so the house was empty all night and we arrived home around the same time early in the morning. We dragged ass into the living room to enjoy some sort of fast food breakfast before passing out when we realized that the entire carpet downstairs was soaked. A pipe had burst beneath our dishwasher during the night and flooded the kitchen, dining room, and living room. Our landlords had the floor replaced within a week, and we went on with our lives. Then, about a week later, we were baking cookies in the oven when all of a sudden the cookies burst into flames. The oven was producing so much heat that I was afraid that the whole thing would catch on fire. The landlord sent a repairman who told us that something had caused the internal thermometer in the oven to be so uncalibrated that you could set the oven temp to 300 degrees, but it would be more like 475 in there. Again, we had it fixed and moved on. It wasn't long after that when the unexplainable and unnerving activity began. The ceiling fans in the rooms would turn on randomly and they would spin so hard that they would rattle and shake to the point that it looked like the thing was about to fly off of the ceiling. Every room was equipped with button switches. There are 4 buttons on the wall, 1 for the light and the other 3 for various speeds for the fan. The fan would make a 2-tone chiming noise when you would push the button to turn it on. No one would be able to turn on a fan without pretty much everyone in the house hearing this chime. We were creeped out, but chalked it up to faulty wiring or a power surge. That chime still haunts my dreams. Then came the TV issue. We all pulled together to buy a large flat-screen TV for our living room, brand new, name brand, extra warranty. The TV would turn on by itself constantly. We returned it to the store, exchanging it for a new one, and thought it would be fine. We would be outside or in a different room and hear the chime, go turn the fan off, and realize that the TV had just turned itself on. This happened 5 or 6 times a day. It was unable to be ignored. 2 separate things in 2 different rooms turning on almost simultaneously. The electrician was called. He found no signs of faulty wiring, and I think he thought we were making it up. After months of this, we began to hear the whistling. 3 notes whistled by an unseen force at all times during the day. This would usually happen when you were in a room by yourself. I would get this sick, anxious feeling like I was being watched, and right then, I would hear the whistle. Someone or something wanted our attention, and he got it. 3 of us were totally convinced that our house was haunted. Our other roommate was a skeptic, and also pretty much had to make this living situation work, or he would be sleeping in his car. About a year and a half of living in this house, dealing with constant phenomena, it ramped up again. We would be in the kitchen making dinner, go eat in the living room, and come back to find every cabinet door open. Sometimes the refrigerator and oven doors were open too. This happened probably 3 or 4 times a week, on top of all the other crap. I was over it, but had no idea how to fix it. I went to Borders bookstore and got a few books about ghosts and hauntings and different information about getting rid of the creepies in one's home. I decided to do a smudging, and I could not have been more sorry about that decision. We planned to do all the sage smudging together, and our Catholic roommate also had his priest come in and do a house blessing that same day. Holy oil and water were sprinkled in each room, the smell of white sage burning. We thought it was over. The next morning, I was walking downstairs like I had a million times before, when my feet completely flew out from under me and I was airborne. I remember thinking, this isn't possible, right before I smashed into the stairs. I landed on my back, right at the edge of them. Picture Lucy pulling the football away before Charlie Brown can kick it, and his tiny feet are kicking in the air. I was Charlie Brown. I landed not on my butt or side, but squarely on my thoracic spine, the upper area of my spine. How on earth did I defy gravity? I had now tripped. I was barefoot on carpeted stairs, sober, and holding the railing. I didn't feel a push. I felt a sweeping force take my legs out from under me. I broke 4 vertebrae in my back, about parallel with my shoulder blades. I've had injections and nerve damage and back braces and a chronic pain that isn't normal for someone in their 20s. I began to look for a new place to live. I found out that I was pregnant with my son about 2 months later, and decided that the risk was too great to live in that house pregnant, so I packed up that night, told my roommates that I would continue to pay my portion of the rent until our lease was up, and moved back in with my parents. I was only staying with my parents for about a month before finding a new safe place for my baby, my now husband, and I. But I lived constantly on edge thinking, what if it followed me? It didn't. What did follow me are the nightmares where I relive the feeling of terror and dread washing over me, and every so often, I can still hear the whistle. I was raised in a house that had a few spirits in it. My family are all skeptics and would always find a way to explain things. A few experiences, and then I'll get to the main story. 1. Our house had 3 stories, with technically 3 master bathrooms, 1 on each floor. The one on the main floor we used as an office. I would constantly hear someone walking around in the office at night, sinks turning on, toilets flushing, and occasionally taking. My parents would always say that someone was awake and making those noises, and the toilet and water running was just faulty pipes. 2. There would always be a shadow figure that would pace on the top floor. There was a balcony that overlooked the foyer, and I would usually see who I presumed was a lady in a dress, pacing back and forth. My parents just said that it was the shadow of someone outside. We were on a hill, overlooking all of our neighbors. I don't know how they thought this was possible. 3. I hated using the upstairs bathroom, which was my bathroom. I would hear talking and singing from that bathroom. When no one was home and I was in there, someone would bang on the door. One time I was showering and listening to music. I heard the banging sound so loud that it shook the room, and then the locked door swung open, and I heard a scream. My parents said that my brother was pranking me, which is something that he never did. Anyways, on to the main event. My brother is about 10 years older than me. He was the only sibling living at home with me and my parents. He had the master bedroom in the basement. I was never really in the basement except for going to the garage because it was in the basement next to the bedroom. I always remember feeling uneasy down there, though. But I wanted a big room, so when my brother moved out, I begged my parents to let me have his room, and eventually they caved. I moved all my stuff downstairs, painted and everything. I loved it. I was talking to my brother about it one day, and he told me, watch out for the little girl who lives down there. She likes to laugh. I was shocked, as obviously he had to be kidding. My whole family besides me never talked about stuff like that. I just kinda giggled and shrugged it off. He was probably just trying to scare me. About a week after I moved into my new room, I had a friend come over. We were just laying on the floor next to the bathroom laughing when she had to go to the bathroom. She closed the door and I was just zoning out when all of a sudden she goes, "That's not funny." I asked her what she was talking about, as I hadn't done anything. She said that she heard someone laughing right outside the door, but I didn't do anything or hear anything. She left freaked out, and I assumed that my brother had put her up to it since she liked him. A few days later, I hear someone in my bedroom while I'm in the shower. I call out thinking it's my mom, but I don't hear a response. I get out, and as I'm putting on my robe, I hear a little girl's giggle, and then, "Are you looking for me?" I freak out. I throw open the door to my room, but no one is there. I checked the garage and ended up setting off the house alarm so no one could have come or gone through the doors without everyone knowing. I run upstairs, and my mom is pissed that I set off the alarm, and I tell her what just happened. She told me my brother had a similar story when we first moved in, but that it was nothing. I called my brother and asked him why he told me to watch out for the little girl. He said that I was the little girl. He was kidding because, quote-unquote, you would always come downstairs and giggle really creepy. I never did anything like that. I told him that, and he got creeped out. I still would occasionally hear the little girl. I never saw her, but she did like to laugh and open the bathroom and closet doors. I named her Sarah. My brother called me up today and asked me about this. He asked me if I was sure that I never tried to scare him by laughing, and I told him no. He got really uncomfortable. I don't think he knows how to handle the fact that our house is haunted. When I was about 12, I'm now 23, I lived in a relatively large, run-down house. I don't know much about its history, but I do know that it was built in 1936, based off of a newspaper that my family found in one of the walls during a renovation. I believe it had about 17 separate rooms, a fact that I was obsessed with when I first moved in. I just liked counting things. These rooms included 2 basements. One was right near the garage with an old door that went down to a concrete cellar where you could access some of the ducts to the house. And there was one within the house that held the laundry room and a storage room. My bedroom and the bedroom adjacent to mine both had crawl spaces going into the walls, 2 of which I covered with dressers. The house often gave me a sense of unease because of the sounds that it made due to it being old, combined with the fact that we couldn't afford heating it all winter, so there were blankets and plastic wrap in all of the windows, constantly making it very dark. Being alone in it was just scary for some reason. I could never shake the feeling of something looking over my shoulder when I was there alone, especially causing me to act like a fool and yell out at nothing while home alone sometimes. Honestly, I'm not sure what caused that, but I'm sure that it had to do with the level of darkness within the house, due to there being no natural lighting and my tiny adolescent brain conjuring up demons just because the house had been settling or something of that sort. One day, I was heading downstairs to do the laundry, and after I was done switching everything over and grabbing the laundry basket, my attention got caught by a large tank of some sort on one of the outer walls of the laundry room. I'm not sure what it held. It wasn't a water heater, but it may have been some sort of reservoir back in the day. It was very, very dusty, since no one ever went near it or touched it at all. Covering the tank this time were dozens of handprints, small to large, and also ones with much longer fingers than a normal hand. I'm not sure if it was due to dragging down, or the hands were just like that. It sent me into fight or flight immediately. I sprinted up the stairs and stayed up there for the rest of the day. It really bothered me trying to think of what could have caused the unnatural-looking, long-fingered handprints. I scared myself a lot thinking about it. Recently, I moved into a new apartment, and in the garage there are a few black handprints that I don't remember being there when we moved in. This could just be because I never noticed them, but I swear they were never there, and one day recently, they had just appeared. It brought back my memory of my old house and the fingerprints in the dust, hence my post here. It makes me a little uneasy, but not much else can be done about it, I'm sure. This event has stayed with me through the years, and I thought I would share it to see what others outside of my perspective think. I'm not really sure, though I have had many more experiences to do with that house in the following years of my life. It was my last year of college, and after getting dumped by my first significant girlfriend the year before, I ended up involved with a woman who lived next door. It was not a healthy relationship for either of us, but I think we cared for each other despite not always being good to each other, and we somehow stayed involved for like a year. One morning while we were brushing our teeth and getting ready for the day at her place, she mentioned a video assignment due in a couple of days. She grew up in a large city and was unfamiliar with the sleepy New England region that we went to college in, but she knew that I had gone to high school about an hour away and had family in the area, so she was hoping that I might be able to suggest somewhere interesting to get footage. I suggested that my parents were buried in a pretty cemetery near the high school in town, and that I hadn't stopped to pay my respects for a bit, so I'd be happy to drive her over there after classes. She liked the idea, and we agreed to meet up in the afternoon, grab some dinner, and go by the graveyard so that she could take her footage. Only we kind of screwed up. It was probably late fall by that point, and the days were getting noticeably shorter. If I remember right, service was slow at the restaurant too. By the time we were getting into my hand-me-down Dodge Grand Caravan to head out to the graveyard, the sun was going down. Not ideal for shooting some quick, amateur footage for video class. As I said, the graveyard was near the high school, which was a little outside the town proper. You passed the school, and then there was this windy road kind of into the woods and up a sizable hill or small mountain overlooking their football field. About halfway up, there was a turn off into the cemetery. It was a peaceful little spot, and my grandparents had plots next to each other. I had visited a lot in the daytime in my first couple of years of college. My grandmother had passed away when I was in high school, but my grandfather lived on a few more years until passing away early into my first years of college. Since I was nearby, I visited him a fair bit as his health began to decline, and in retrospect, I really value those opportunities to spend some one-on-one time with him, even if I feel a little guilty for not appreciating it at the time. I was a snotty 19-year-old and didn't realize what a cool guy that he actually was, and how lucky that I was to be part of his life in that way. After he died, I continued to stop by the cemetery several times a year to check on their grave sites and pay my respects. I had been to the cemetery a lot, but never after sundown. There were two entrances. The main one that took you through the center of the graveyard, and a side entrance that led out onto a little road, just big enough for one car that was a straight shot to my grandparents' plots. To the left of this little gravel road was an open field with newer-looking graves, and to the right was a more overgrown area with older-looking headstones, and the real tree line for the woods beyond that. Even in daytime, because of the brush and the shade from the trees, it always looked dim off that way, and my sister and I had both remarked about how it was kind of creepy over there. So this woman I was seeing and I were driving to the cemetery at sundown, just hoping that we'd be able to get in and figure out how to get some footage for her assignment. The main gate was locked, but the side entrance was open, which was better for us anyways, since it was the more direct route to my grandparents' graves. I pulled the minivan in slowly, careful to stay off the grass as much as possible, and we stopped and got out at the intersection nearest to where my grandparents were buried. She got the camera she had checked out from the school's library equipment room, and was trying to get some footage of the headstones or something while I walked over to say hi to my grandparents. Only it was too dark, and after a couple of minutes she asked if I would turn the headlights on to see if the light would help her get something usable. Not knowing how long we'd be out there, and not wanting to drain the battery, I decided to just go ahead and turn on the engine too. After a few more minutes, the van started acting weird. It wasn't a new vehicle. My parents had bought it before I was in high school and had given it to me years before, so I was pretty familiar with the sound of the engine idling. That night in the graveyard, the engine began to make unfamiliar noises. It was very high-pitched and loud for an idling vehicle. That immediately raised concern for me because the last thing that I wanted was for the van to break down in the middle of the cemetery where we may or may not have been trespassing. I started to walk back toward the van to investigate. As I walked toward it, though, the headlights began to flicker rapidly. It was sort of an inconsistent strobing effect, which was like a what the heck kind of thing. They had never done that before, and never did it after. Same with the engine noise. Then I heard something even more disturbing. To my side, off in the wooded area with the older graves, something started moving around in the brush. I looked, and in the darkness, I swear, I saw movement to accompany the sound. I couldn't see what it was too dark, but something was coming slowly towards us out of those woods. I instantly felt as if it was time to go, and that we shouldn't be there. Fortunately, my companion agreed, even though she hadn't got enough footage, because she heard the approaching rustling as well. We got into the van, which continued to sound really weird, but thankfully it went into gear and drove normally as we got the hell out of there. The lights stopped flickering as I got turned around, and the engine sound returned to normal as we approached the gate. The most rational explanation for the rustling was an animal, but that didn't explain the van acting so strangely. I kept it for another 6 months before trading it in, and it never made noise like that while idling again, and the headlights were always reliable, never flickering. I also have had other strange experiences in my life, but this was the first and only time I ever felt that overwhelming sense that I had to leave or that I shouldn't be somewhere. I can't help but wonder if both my sister and I had always thought that wooded spot off to the right was spooky for a good reason, and if I might have found out what that reason was had my companion and I stayed for a few more minutes that night. I'm going to preface this post by saying that paranormal experiences are not unknown to me. I have seen ghosts many times over my life, and my mom claims to have seen me playing with them as a child. She was a psychic medium, so I spent a good deal of my childhood around this stuff, but those experiences are for another time. This is just to assure you that I have had experiences with the paranormal before, and that what I experienced I consider to be abnormal generally, as most of my experiences up until now have been positive, or at least neutral. This was a few years ago in my very early 20s. I'm in my mid to late 20s now. I haven't had any paranormal experiences since a little while after my mom passed away when I was a teenager. I was starting to think the things I had experienced didn't happen at all. General denial. One night, on a whim, while driving around a suburb near my house, I managed to convince my boyfriend to come with me to the local cemetery. I was going through a bit of an edgy phase and thought that going to a graveyard at night would be cool. This is a cemetery in a big city, and it's extremely large. I didn't believe in ghosts hanging around in a cemetery, so I thought that it would be fine. I believed that ghosts usually hung around the places that they died, or places where they had unfinished business, and that it was very unlikely that they would actually be in a graveyard. It was sometime in October, but not Halloween. We got to the cemetery around 11:30 p.m. We had our phones with us and were using them as torches. We hopped the fence to the cemetery and began to look at all the graves, pointing out the most interesting ones and kind of just messing around. The place was completely deserted, as cemeteries tend to be at that time of night. We walked further and further in and entered a part of the cemetery where the graves were quite a bit larger and much older. By now it had likely been around half an hour. As we were walking down the path, my boyfriend commented that there was a strange smell lingering around, which was extremely weird, as my boyfriend cannot smell at all. He lost his sense of smell due to a bunch of infections and other problems with his ears and sinuses as a kid. I couldn't smell anything, and I have an above average sense of smell, so we both just shrugged the experience off as just weird. Later on, I was looking at one of the graves when my boyfriend shook my shoulder and pointed at one of the largest graves a few meters into the distance. I'm terrible at knowing where people are pointing, but this time, I spotted it right away. It was a little girl, I'd guess around 11 or 12 years old. She had very dark brown or black hair that looked well cared for and quite long. She was sitting on top of the grave, with her legs dangling over the edge. At first I saw her wearing a lacy white dress, like a nightgown that a rich girl might wear. It looked old, but I'm no expert, so I couldn't tell you exactly how old, but maybe the 1900s, early 1900s? I looked away to look at my boyfriend, and when I looked back, she was wearing a different dress. All I remember is that it was red, because at this point I was super scared. Something about the entire situation felt wrong to me. I felt extremely fearful, and due to the fact that ghosts were very normal for me, this was extremely unusual. I would never feel unsafe seeing a ghost in the past. It was around this time that I noticed that the cemetery was eerily quiet. There were no sounds of bats, and there were a lot of fruit bats in that area. There were no other sounds of animals, and the air felt stale and stagnant. We just stood and stared at the little girl for what felt like an eternity, weirdly transfixed, and then we both ran for it up the path at full speed. I turned for a second to see if she was still there, and she was gone completely. It made me run faster, honestly, and the whole time we were both dead silent. When we got back to our car, we sat there for ages trying to work out what we had just witnessed. We were trying to rationalize it, but as we have both had paranormal experiences before, we knew it had to be a ghost. For a few months afterward, I felt continuously like I was being watched, and had frequent nightmares about seeing the little girl in our apartment. I always felt uneasy. We eventually moved around 30 minutes away, and the feelings and the dreams stopped. I've since tried to research the ghost, but haven't had anything turn up, though there is a local ghost tour at the cemetery, and maybe the guide might know something. Ever since then, my paranormal experiences have been more frequent, and have been getting more unsettling and disturbing. My boyfriend has been experiencing things more frequently as well. I'm employed as a policeman, and I work the night shift in a tiny little town. The population here barely breaks 1,000. Needless to say, I know the town well enough to be able to tell when something is wrong. Near the center of the town, there's the old school they used before they built the new elementary and high schools. The building is listed as a historical site and can't be demolished, but due to asbestos, renovations would cost the town too much to be worth the work. This school sits within feet of the public library, and behind it sits the town's fairground. It isn't an official fairground, but every year they had bull riding and small shows that they would put on for kids during the summer. With all of those details out of the way, I will explain what happened. I noticed the backlight to the library on, which is not normal since it wasn't on all night, and it isn't a motion light, so I parked on the north side of the old school grounds. I walked through the fence and had to pass the school to get to the library. I would stop every few feet and listen because the gravel was so loud. When I stopped the second or third time, I thought I heard a squeal in the school, like the sound of a door. At first I didn't think anything of it, since I figured I was hearing things. The town just replaced all the windows on this building, so I thought I wouldn't be able to hear the inside. When I investigated the light and found all the doors locked, I started walking back around to my car. As I passed by the school again, I heard a noise in the building again, and I stopped and listened. And as I shined my light, I noticed a basement window was broken out. So when I walked up to the window, I looked down and in, and didn't see anything. I kept walking, and I heard the squeal again. It reminded me of those bathroom doors in schools that the hinges always squealed really loud and echoed. When I came around the corner, I saw 2 cats roughhousing in the dirt. They stopped to watch me, and then both of them turned and looked at the door. I couldn't see for myself because it was around another corner. One hissed, and they both bolted away from the school, which put me on edge. I know this school is absolutely not in use, nor are there any plans to use this school anytime soon. Also, the local kids and homeless don't come here, ever. It's a landmark the city as a whole really admires, and there hasn't ever been an issue with breaking and entering, at least not for a long time. So when I came around the corner, I saw the door and I walked up to it to see what the cats had run from. I looked for other animals, but that didn't make sense because they looked up as if someone were standing in the window of the door. Not like they would if it were a raccoon or a dog that ran off without me seeing. When I looked in the window with my light, I could see a gigantic Raggedy Ann painted on the wall, and I assumed this was the kindergarten section or something. And then I stepped back from the door getting ready to leave, and I heard whistling. It wasn't really loud, but it was loud enough to make me stop. That little voice in the back of my head was talking now and telling me I was just hearing things, but the dude that likes the dump of fear of the unknown told me to go back to the door. So I went back and listened again, and I know it was whistling, and not like the squeak of an animal or an object from inside. It got louder when I came to the door again, and it had a tune, but I don't know how to describe it. So now thinking someone is in the school, I went around and checked all the doors, including the second floor door that I had to climb the rusty metal stairs that were more like a death trap to see in through. When I couldn't find a way into the school, I checked it all over again, and when I left, I couldn't figure out what it was. The whistling had stopped, and I even hung around outside for a few minutes without my light on, just watching, figuring out if someone was in there. They would eventually need to use a light to get around, or to get back out, but there was nothing after 20 or so minutes. So I got in my car, circled the block, and parked down the way with my lights off to watch for someone to come out at some point. But no one did, and there haven't been any lights on. I know this story seems kind of boring compared to the others, but working nights gets you on edge. And for all the things I know I experienced before, this was in my top 5 bone-chilling moments while on the job. So about 15 years ago, I was living with my ex-girlfriend, my sister, and her husband in an old house not far from town. Within the first few weeks of living there, strange things were happening regularly. Lights going out randomly, noises upstairs. At one point, one of the windows at the back of the house was cut. Like someone had went in with glass cutters trying to break in, but gave up on it and left. Creepy stuff like that. That was bad enough, but things got pretty severe as time went on. One week in particular was truly insane. The first thing that happened that week was on a Tuesday night. Everyone was working, and I was home alone watching TV when I noticed that our cat was acting really weird, backed into a corner, and arched up as though she was scared. When I went to get up, the electricity went out in the house, and it was pitch black inside. The second that happened, I heard really loud footsteps running down the stairs toward me. I got up and braced myself for whatever it was, but there was nothing. I gathered myself and went outside to the front garden to check if the other houses' lights were on, but my house was the only one that was dark. I went to the fuse box to reset the trip switch, and all was back to normal. A few days later, I think it was a Tuesday, we were all sitting in the living room watching a movie and eating a pizza. The lights were on, there was a good atmosphere in the house, when out of nowhere, a massive bang happened upstairs. We go up to check it out, and I went into our bedroom and saw that my bedside table was in the middle of the room. But the worst and last thing that happened to me was on a Saturday night. I'll never forget this. It still gives me chills when I think about it. We go to bed, everything's normal. We watch a bit of a movie and fall asleep. I wake up facing the wall and glance at the alarm clock. It reads 3:13 a.m. I turned over to go back to sleep and saw my ex standing in the center of the room. Confused, I begin to sit up and ask her what's wrong. But as I start to sit up, I realize my ex is asleep in bed next to me. A surge of fear runs through my core, and I'm frozen to the spot. My eyes adjust, and I just barely make out the figure. It was a young girl in a nightdress with a cartoon character on it, soaking wet, with her head looking down at the floor. I could hear the water droplets landing on the carpet, and I'm just sitting there totally in shock, unable to believe my eyes. After a couple of seconds, her apparition melted away and faded out of sight. I got up and turned on the lights and tried to tell myself that it was just a night terror or something, but the problem with that was that there was a wet patch where she had been standing. We moved out shortly after that, but I can still picture her to this day. Creepiest thing I've ever experienced. I live in Lompoc, California. I also live across the street from the cemetery. I used to hop the fence on one side of the cemetery to go to a friend's house who lived on the opposite side of it. If I went around, it would easily be a 4 to 5 block walk to her house. The keeper of the grounds who lived there called the cops on me several times, so I stopped. I also have been driving for years now, so there's no need anymore. Anyways, on one of my walks, I noticed a treehouse in the cemetery off to the side. It was in a trench in a deep wooded area. There's been a few nights when I've gone and hung out inside of this treehouse with a few friends. However, every time I went, I would see spirits. I was scared many times, but seeing my friends happy and enjoying themselves was what made everything worth it. Except for one night in December of 2018 when I had brought new friends with me. During this time I was going through a lot and kind of hanging out with a bad group of people, some of whom were with me that night. Like I've mentioned, I always at least see something, but usually only for a few seconds. This time, though, I saw a rather large man, kind of burly yet completely transparent. I felt him before I actually saw him, how sad and lost he was. But I could also feel how gentle that his soul was, and that he was only looking for help or just someone to understand. Since I could feel him, I started hearing footsteps breaking twigs, leaves, and such. After the initial feeling, I started hearing footsteps breaking twigs, leaves, and such. My friends heard it too. I looked over, and I saw this man, and all I could feel was how confused that he was. He started to walk up, but froze once I saw him. I yelled out to him that it was okay and that we weren't going to hurt him. I told him that it was safe for him to be there if he wanted to stick around, but then my friends wanted to leave with how freaked out that they were. I walked out first to be his guide, and he walked in front of me until he disappeared seconds later. I don't think I really helped him, considering that I didn't have much chance being with that group of friends and all, but I could feel just how gentle that he was, like I said. Sometimes I feel that gentle presence whenever I visit the graveyard, and I think of him. Today I went, because today is also the anniversary of me losing a friend. I felt that gentle presence when I visited her grave today. The house my grandparents owned when I was younger had a lady in the basement. At least, that's what I called her. My older sister called her the lady on the landing, because she only ever saw her on the landing to the basement. Either way, basement. I haven't correlated any of my personal stories with my cousins or siblings except my own. My aunt used to live down there, and I haven't dared to ask her about it because she had an experience when she was younger where she was physically lifted out of the bed by her ankles, and because of that, you can't even mention ghosts or paranormal stuff because she covers her ears and walks away. But that's another story for another day. Anyways, my personal stories. I'll try to keep them short and sweet. The first time I can recall seeing her, I was hanging out with my aunt, a different aunt than the one mentioned above. She and her son were in the house while my mom was working and my grandparents were in Hawaii. Now, for some reason she chose to bathe me in the basement bathroom, which was weird because there was another fully functional bathroom with a bathtub on the second floor of the house, as well as the shower in my grandparents' room. My cousin was expecting his friends to come over and play. The doorbell rang, so my aunt ran up to answer it, but had my cousin stay with me. I was about 3 or 4 at the time, he was about 9, just to keep an eye on me. She called him up to go play with his friends, and as soon as he left the bathroom and was halfway up the stairs, the door slammed shut and the lights turned off. Then, all of a sudden, I see this woman literally in the mirror facing me, but it looked like she was getting ready to walk out of it because she was getting closer. I, of course, start screaming. My cousin is on the other side of the door desperately trying to get in. My aunt comes flying down the stairs and couldn't get the door to open either. She kept telling me to unlock it, but I was stuck, frozen in terror. Finally, she gets the door open and sees nothing. She flips the switch on and gets me out of the tub, and nothing else was really said about it. Later that week, I was again with my aunt as my mother was working. I asked if I could sleep in Grandma's bed since they weren't there, and at the time, at my little size, that bed seemed humongous. She called them in Hawaii to ask for their permission, and they said it was fine. So I'm asleep in their bed, and I'm not exactly positive if it was a dream or an actual experience that had taken place. I was in the center of the bed. From there, you could see straight into their bathroom on the right side of the room, and then straight down the hallway into the computer room. Mind you, this is on the second floor now, not the basement. In this maybe dream, the bathroom light flipped on and I could see her again coming out of the mirror. It was like I was locked in place, but I could see down the hall in the computer room my mom sitting at my grandma's computer. I tried to call her, but it came out as a dull whisper. I tried over and over, but the sound just wouldn't come out. The woman actually made it out of the mirror this time, and got just a step out of the bathroom when I was able to get unlocked, and I ran down the hallway into the room where my mother was. Again, I don't think anything was ever actually said about this. Another time, maybe 2 years later, my mom and I were sleeping in the basement bedroom, and the closet doors were those full floor-to-ceiling mirrors. I saw her again, but my mom was within reach, and I woke her up and she saw this woman too, and grabbed me and ran upstairs. I guess a more adequate name for her would be the lady in the mirror, but I've been calling her the lady in the basement for what seems like forever. I know for a fact that the cousin from the first story saw her on a number of occasions. My sister saw her, my brother saw her, and a couple of other cousins when they would visit from out of state. It really only affected us kids. Over the past couple of years, I've asked my mother if she remembers it. My sister, my aunt that would watch me, and then her son and everyone is pretty much on the same page of, this was real. My mother's theory is that she was a family member from the past that just stuck with the family, and she didn't mean to be scary, she just was, because we weren't used to seeing that sort of thing. I asked my grandpa about it last week over text if he recalls me ever saying anything to him about her, and he replied, no, and I'd prefer it if you didn't. Now, here's the kicker. My grandma passed in December of 2018. I had not seen the lady in the basement since that particular house. They moved houses, hell, even moved states, and I never saw her in any of the other houses. Not once. But after my grandma died, I saw her in the house that I was living in that wasn't even close to the original house where I first saw her. Now I'm wondering if my mom's theory on her being a relative that passed and just was attached to us is even true, and that when my grandma passed, she followed her, but made her rounds to say bye? Because right after I saw her at my own house, I called my sister immediately and she freaked out because she had seen her at her house the day before. I haven't seen her since, and I pray I don't see her again. Half of me wants to write a letter to the new owners of that house from my childhood and ask them if they have seen her as well. I've always had some kind of interest in the paranormal. As someone who grew up in a religious household but has always struggled with the concept of faith, I think what's always drawn me to it is the idea of proof. Proof of something beyond this life. Proof that death isn't the end. So I guess that's what set me up for this experience. This was 4-ish years ago on an October night. This happened with 2 friends of mine who I'll call Jim and Lisa. I've known Jim since 2nd grade, and Lisa since high school. Lisa and I went to the same college for a bit, and we had a mutual interest in the paranormal. Given the time of year that it was, close to Halloween, we decided to go and do some ghost hunting of our own. I called up Jim, who also had some interest, and planned to meet up and drive to a local cemetery not far from where we were. So this place definitely has the spooky factor to it. It's on a residential road, but the section the cemetery's in is really wooded and separated from everything. It's set back on a hill, and carved into the hillside right up against the road are the keeps that they used to lay bodies out in when the ground was too frozen to do burials back in the day. Jim and I had scoped this place out during the summer during the day because it was close to where he lived, so I kinda knew the layout. We all met up and parked next to it. I had brought a voice recorder from school. I worked at the school radio station, so it was fairly nice. We started walking around and asked some innocuous questions. Lisa claims to be sensitive, which I'm skeptical of, but that will come into play a little later. As we were walking around, kind of creeped out, we walked toward the back of the cemetery. It goes fairly far back, so we were poking around reading stones with flashlights when Lisa and I could swear that we heard someone walking around near the middle of the cemetery. All 3 of us were together near the back, and there was 1000% not anyone else out there. Could it have been some college kids hyping themselves up? Maybe. It's hard for me to really confirm with hindsight whether we were being overly imaginative, but we were pretty sketched out. After about 15 to 20 minutes, we figured that we should pack it up. Lisa and I were kind of freaked out still because we were fairly convinced that something was walking around near the center of those headstones. She also kept saying that she felt like something was compelling us to leave, and that we weren't welcome. Jim was kind of indifferent and wasn't really noticing anything super crazy, so we started making our way down the hill. This is when a weird thing happened. As we were walking down the hill, I heard a stone skip past me as if someone had kicked or thrown it. I figured that it was just Jim, as he's apt to do that sort of thing. But as I looked and was about to say something to him, he was about 10 feet to my left. He definitely didn't kick anything at me. The weirdest stuff that we found was on the recorder when we got back. I want to make this clear, this was not a super windy night. There was a light breeze at best. But the recorder sounded like it was windy as hell because we caught a ton of what I call interference. It was really deep bass tones that sounded like the microphone on the recorder were being overloaded. The creepy part was that there were times where there was a rhythmic quality to it, like something was speaking but couldn't get through fully. I'd say it sounds like when someone's talking in another room with the door shut, where you can hear the noise, but not much in the way of actual words. I did get it on the other investigations with this recorder, but never at that level. So while it's possible that it could have been an issue with the recorder, I'm not entirely sure. We also got some really direct, creepy EVPs. Toward the end of our time there, you can hear me on the recorder saying, "Hey guys, we should go," in reference to the creepy walking sounds from the middle of the cemetery. During the discussion from the 3 of us, there's a moan that's pretty audible that no one heard while we were there. It sounded like something was upset that we were leaving. This was reinforced by a minute later when Lisa asked, "Do you want us to leave or do you want us to stay?" And a voice pretty clearly answered, "Stay. I want you to stay," which was creepy enough to hear in general, but the whispery quality to it makes the hair raise up on the back of my neck. The epilogue to this is Lisa claimed that there was weird stuff happening all around her house the weekend after we went. Banging on the wall, noises in the other rooms. Full disclosure, Lisa does have a bit of history with mental illness, so I guess you might could chalk it up to that. The part that gives me pause is that we were talking about this at school one day, and her sister called from the house complaining about all the weird crap that was happening. While I think her sister also has some sort of history, I think it's mostly anxiety-based, but I'm not 100% sure, honestly. I do find it a stretch that her sister would call and make a big deal out of it if stuff wasn't legitimately taking place. I only wish that I'd gone to the house and experienced whatever it was firsthand just to see for myself. From as early as I can remember, I used to fall asleep watching old, reel-to-reel black and white cartoons on my wall, like Steamboat Willie. I clearly remember the jittery, shutter-like quality of the cartoon from the old reel-to-reel projector. There was no actual movie projector in my room. At night, I would wake up to someone tapping me on the shoulder. I had a usual routine that I followed when it happened, which involved burying myself under my covers and telling myself that I would count to 7 and then turn over to see what was there. Not sure if there's a significance to 7. To this day, I like to end things with 7. For example, I set my alarm at 6:27 and not 6:30. But anyhow, I would go through the counting routine multiple times. I wanted to see what was there, but I was a kid and didn't really want to see what was there. My mom would tell me that I just needed to confront it and tell it to leave me alone. It took years to build up that courage. I don't remember exactly how long, but I must have been in my early teens before I actually did get the nerve up to turn over right away and tell it to leave me alone and stop tapping me on the shoulder. Once I confronted it, it did stop. Then comes my baby sister when I was 15. She would wake up screaming in the middle of the night quite often. Once she was old enough to talk, she said that she was scared of the hand that came up between her wall and the bed and tapped her on the shoulder at night. When I was around 15 or so, my mom and stepfather got divorced in a pretty dramatic way. It's like the whole household was just turned upside down. Everyone's routines were off. Mom was out doing something most nights after work. My little sister spent more time with her friends. And I became something of a night owl, usually waiting until the wee morning hours to lie down. Our house was a simple one in a rural area. 2 stories, with a huge backyard sharing a fence with a cow pasture and the entrance to some thick woods. The house had a lot of problems, but I enjoyed taking over the maintenance and gardening work as they gave me something to do when I was feeling depressed. For some perspective, our kitchen windows looked out directly to the fence described above. The left half of the fence bordered one of the back corners of the big cow pasture, while the right half bordered the entrance to the woods, which had a rather overgrown trailhead just barely visible from the kitchen window. For the most part, though, all you could see was overgrown grass and shrubbery, at least 4 or 5 feet high, and some low-hanging trees of mixed oak and cedar. This backdrop added a sort of eerie tranquility to our property, which I appreciated from the first day we moved in. One night, I took a break from my homework after realizing I had stayed up way too late on a Thursday, even for my standards. I went downstairs to make some food, and my dog followed me like she always did. I made a grilled cheese, and while I was at the sink cleaning the pan, I noticed some of the grass from the wood line start to shuffle around. It startled me at first, but as soon as I began to fixate on it, I saw no more disturbance. We lived in wildlife country at the time, so I figured it was probably a deer, coyote, or a cougar. Unsurprising for the latter, given that the farmer who owned the pasture had dozens of cows and sometimes didn't bring them in at night. Strangely, though, I noticed this for several more nights, always when I was doing the dishes after eating. I would look out the window, see the grass shuffle around, then see nothing further when I fixated on the spot. I was always a fan of scary movies, and I tended to be a jumpy kid, so each time I convinced myself I wasn't really seeing any sort of pattern. This changed, though, when my dog would start fixating on the woods herself and barking at night. Furthermore, our motion sensor security light would begin to stay activated sometimes for hours on end, only switching off when I would get to the kitchen to make my midnight snacks. Eventually, I told my mom about all this, and while she initially seemed concerned, she pointed out that we did live behind the woods after all, and so we should expect animals or occasional homeless squatters near our property. She said that if I was concerned, I could always call the police or animal control. I didn't disagree, and for the most part gave the matter no further thought. One night, though, I decided that a 1 a.m. dip in our hot tub in the backyard sounded good. I changed, and my dog and I went outside. I climbed in, closed my eyes, and zoned out like usual. I was whipped awake when I heard a loud crunch, followed by what sounded like someone falling over into some bushes. I stood up, turned around, and shouted, "Who's there?" But no one replied. It was dead silent, and I had the creeps. I put my robe on and went inside. The next day I told my neighbor friend and crush about this, and she thought I was being ridiculous, but nonetheless agreed to go with me to check out that part of the woods to see if there was any evidence of anyone or anything hiding in the direction that I had heard the noise coming from. We stomped through the woods until we got to where we could see the back of my house. We checked every shrub and every blackberry bush, but found nothing. It was probably a coyote or something, deciding on whether or not you'd make a good dinner, the neighbor girl said, snarking. I playfully flipped her off, then laughed, quietly relieved that there was no creepy person stalking me the previous night. Well, of course, I might have been wrong about that, because that night, when I was making my usual sandwich, our security light came on, and I raced to the back door to see what was up. I saw what I could barely make out to be a shadowy, 6-foot-tall or so figure disappear from the trail and into the brush to the right of it. My heart skipped a beat, and my dog, probably sensing my nerves, began barking wildly. I opened the door and shouted, "The fuck's out there? Come out!" Of course, there was nothing but silence. After sitting in the dining room for an hour, I figured that I was being paranoid and seeing what I was subconsciously afraid of being out there. I called my neighbor back, and she, surprisingly, did not call me crazy, and told me she would tell her dad about it in the morning. I never saw this sort of thing again, and my neighbor's dad chalked it up to being a homeless person camping out in the woods. Or, at the very most, a stalker from one of the houses around ours. Something he explained wouldn't be surprising as my sister was quite a looker, and he thought it made sense that she would have a stalker, as if this was supposed to make me feel better. Well, I suppose it did in the end, as months passed and I forgot about it fairly quickly. That is, until a local news bulletin came out about a sexual predator having been recently apprehended by local police, after a report from a couple living a few houses down from us was filed about the wife being approached by the tall and gaunt man in the evening hours as she was watering her garden boxes. She said he suddenly appeared, quietly as if he were trying to sneak up on her. When she noticed him, she demanded his name, but he darted back into the woods. She called the sheriff immediately, and half an hour or so later the department combed through the woods and apprehended the man, who was hiding under a fallen tree. All the report said was that the man claimed he was living in the woods for months, surviving on snacks from a nearby gas station, and would not give a reason for why he was out there. However, he was apparently wanted for numerous sexual offenses on minors and vulnerable adults some years prior, whatever those ended up being. Now, years later, I still get uncomfortable looking into the woods at night, anywhere I live. Who can blame me? I live in Oklahoma, and I'm really big into finding abandoned places and exploring them. I found out a few months ago that there is a forgotten graveyard a few minutes away from my house. I've lived in Oklahoma my whole life, and I've never even heard anyone mention this place before. So I looked it up and did more research on it to make sure that I wasn't walking into something crazy or where I could possibly be harmed. I found out that it was the site of an old schoolhouse, and that there was no marker, so people had basically just forgotten that it was even there over the years unless they had a loved one that was buried there. I waited until daylight to go just in case, because I wanted to be able to see everything around me since I was in the middle of nowhere. I ended up asking my sister if she wanted to go with me so that I wouldn't be alone. And God, am I glad that I asked her to come, because I never thought I would have saw what I did. We woke early the next morning to go before it got hot because it was summertime. It was 10 minutes away from the house, so it was an easy drive. Finding the exact location was the hard part. Once we did find it, we pulled up and got out and started to look around. The grass was all overgrown, and you couldn't really see any of the headstones anymore. We had to be super careful walking around because we didn't want to step on anyone. We explored for about an hour or so, and then we stumbled upon this opening where the old schoolhouse used to be. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, it sounded like someone or something was running right at us. But there was no one else around. And mind you, again, we're in the middle of nowhere. So we stop what we're doing and back up a bit to look and see. Neither of us spook easy, so we just looked around and we didn't see anything. We decided it was getting too hot to just stand out there for much longer, and so we started walking back to the car. Again, it sounded like something or someone was running at us, but faster this time. We both took off sprinting to the car and didn't stop until we got in and locked the doors. As we sat there, I looked up more about this place, and it's known by a few people to have major activity, and it's so bad that they actually tell you not to go at nighttime. I read stories of people who said they had seen figures walking around, or someone asking them for help and then disappearing a few minutes later. I'm glad that I decided to wait until daylight, and that I asked my sister to come with me, because I don't know what I would have done if I heard someone that I couldn't even see running at me if I were alone. I've never been back to this graveyard. It actually kinda scares me to even think about going back after what happened. When, though it wasn't anything serious like some of the other stuff people had said happened to them, maybe one day I'll have the guts to return. I always visit my son at the cemetery, usually at night. I love how peaceful it is there, and just look at the clear, starry sky. Today has been a rough day for me. I cried and prayed on my way to the cemetery. First, I noticed how bright that the moon is tonight. I usually have to use my phone's flashlight so that I could see where I'm going. Not tonight. My son has a toy box on his grave. Letters, books, and toys are inside. It's a little plastic tote. The lid wasn't there when I got there tonight. It was on the ground. Today's weather wasn't really nice. Everything must be wet, I thought. But no. The card and the letter that's sitting on the very top were dry. The teddy bear was dry. It couldn't have been the wind because the papers were there. I don't know if someone opened it and left it open, or something else. Nothing was taken, and nothing was moved. Tonight, I'm sitting here at the cemetery, totally at peace. This happened around 13 years ago when I was a sophomore in college, attending a liberal arts school in Suffolk County, New York. Within the first month or two of freshman year, I had found myself in a very tight-knit group of fellow theater geeks, 6 guys, myself included, and 1 girl. And they all loved horror movies and ghost stories. I had found my crew. Freshman year was tough, but we all held each other up and made the whole experience more enjoyable for one another. At the beginning of sophomore year, we decided that in October, as the Halloween season was ramping up, we would find a creepy, wooded spot in a nearby town some night and scare the crap out of ourselves. We did some research and found that there was a particularly isolated area about 30 minutes away, infamous for paranormal sightings. Perfect. The 7 of us split into 2 different cars and headed out into the night. Allow me to set the scene. You turn off of a very busy main road, flooded with strip malls and restaurants and whatnot, and you're almost immediately greeted by complete darkness. Again, this area was very heavily wooded. It was essentially a large web of winding roads surrounded by trees. Very few streetlights and very few houses. Without a GPS or a good sense of direction, one could easily get lost in there. We all made sure to have fully charged phones and flashlights just in case, but the goal was to keep driving until we collectively decided to pull over and go exploring. So, per the directions, we made a left off of the main road, driving about 30 minutes or so into this dark network, picking directions at random, just getting intentionally lost. Our cars made a turn and, to our surprise, there was a huge log in front of us. We had reached a dead end of some kind, with nothing but trees beyond it. We all got out to see exactly what this was, stepped over the log, and noticed 2 narrow trails leading off in different directions. This seemed like as good a time as any to grab our flashlights and do some amateur ghost hunting. We flipped a coin and set off on the trail to the right. The trail was so narrow that we had to walk single file to avoid getting whacked by branches. For whatever reason, I ended up in the back. I'm usually pretty rational and level-headed, but I have to say, the further we went in, the more I was overcome with an uneasy feeling. I kept hearing sounds deep in the woods, unable to shake the sense that we were being watched. But I seemed to be the only one who heard these things, so I shrugged it off as my imagination. In any case, the whole point of us being there was to get scared. Not to mention the fact that we were 7 able-bodied college students. What would we come across that could take us down? We headed down this trail for about 20 minutes, and just when I thought it would never end, we came to a massive clearing. And I mean massive. It was a large, open field of unkempt grass. Comparable in scope to a golf course, but not nearly as well manicured. The trees surrounded the entire field, which was so large we could not see the end of it from where we were standing. I was so thrilled to get out of that narrow trail, but I don't think any of us were expecting to find an area so vast. One of us looked to the right and said, "Hey, check that out." We all turned and there was an old, dilapidated house several hundred yards away. The house was completely dark, with no cars or signs of anyone actually living there. We walked over and shined our flashlights at it, and sure enough, the windows and doors were all boarded up. I peered between the boards on one of the windows, and what I could see was an old white couch covered in plastic, but an otherwise empty room. Whoever used to live there, they were long gone. Because there was no way in, and because we all felt sufficiently creeped out by the house anyway, we all decided to walk closer to the trail we had come in from, have a seat in the field, and figure out where to go next. We walked back towards the narrow trail, but before we could sit, my friend Mark stopped what he was doing. His expression dropped, and he pointed. We all turned, and on a very far side of the field, directly across from where we had come in, we could see someone tall, lanky, and pale dancing among the trees. By dancing, I mean that it was skipping around, grabbing a tree, swinging around it, and then doing the same thing to another one. Basically kind of like a do-si-do type motion. The moon was so bright, and the woods were so dark, It actually took a second for us to really understand what we were looking at. Jay, the 6'4" skeptic of the group, wasn't seeing it. I leaned into him, pointed in that direction, and said, "Jay, look where I'm pointing. Don't you see that?" He squinted a bit, and the second that he did see it, he gasped with everything that he had, clutched my arm, and whispered, "What the fuck is that?" What happened next sent shockwaves through all of us. Whoever it was, they stopped dancing, looked in our direction, and started charging straight at us. Without even thinking, we freaked and ran back to the trail. Yet again, Jay was the only one who didn't see what was happening. He shouted after us, "Guys, what is it? Where are you going?" After about 15 seconds of running like hell, I heard Jay scream, "Holy shit!" I looked back and saw his flashlight following the rest of us into the trail. While the walk into the woods took about 20 minutes, we made it back to our 2 cars, hopped in, and were peeling away in closer to 5. Once we were at a safe distance, we pulled over, got out, and checked in with each other about what had just happened. My heart was pounding, and I knew everyone else was feeling the same way. Nearly 15 years later, we are all still friends, living in different states yet keeping in touch through marriages, divorces, children, etc. But occasionally, out of the blue, one of us will send a group text to the others, something to the effect of, "The woods. That really happened, right?" It most certainly did. That experience is always in the back of my mind, and I'm pretty sure it always will be. Here's the thing that still resonates with me about that night. Whoever that was, they were dancing maniacally in the woods at 1 in the morning, and then ran directly for a group of young adults, not at all fazed by the fact that they were severely outnumbered. Did that thing know we were there from the second we parked? Was it the sound that I kept hearing when we walked the trail? Whatever the case may be, when he came for us that night, you can be sure none of us wanted to stick around to see what he was truly capable of. In 2011, my older cousin bought a small 2-bedroom single house in a quiet neighborhood for retired folks. The house was very small, with only 850 square feet of interior space, but it sat on a large plot of land. We could have easily fit 2 more houses like it on that lot, and still would have nice leftover space for yards and gardening. I was still a college student at that time, and I lived with my cousin. When he bought the house, I moved in with him. There were the 2 of us living there. According to the real estate agent, the house had been abandoned for around 3 years. The previous owner basically left it unmaintained and moved to a different state. The house had 1 main floor, a small attic, and an unfinished basement. The first time we walked in, the floorboards were already rotted out. We could see the basement through them. Everything was in horrible condition, and we would have to do major restoration to make it livable again. The property also had a small storage shed in the back of the lot. My cousin got a great offer, so he took the deal without much hesitation. Weird things started to happen when we began our restoration work. One day we were working on the bathroom. My cousin told me that he had to go to Home Depot for some stuff, and so he left. I heard him open the door, go outside, close it, turn on his car, and drive away. I was taking apart the old boards that were nailed on the bathroom walls. My back was facing the bathroom door. 5 minutes after my cousin left, the bathroom door, which was open, started to slowly move to the closed position. I knew this because I could hear the creaky old door sound that it made. I turned around and saw the door continue to close on its own. Then it stopped just as it touched the door frame and bounced back a little. I thought maybe it's just the wind. Then, suddenly the door pulled itself shut tightly, as if there was someone on the other side of the door. It happened right in front of me. I was only 4 feet away. No wind could have done that. Plus, all the windows were closed around the house, so there couldn't possibly be any form of breeze. You might think that maybe the AC caused it, but no. This old house did not have central AC. We had to put in window AC units afterward. At this point, I thought my cousin was messing with me, so I called out to him, but there was no response. Just silence. I opened the door, continued to call for him, telling him to stop playing around. But my cousin was not there. I checked the parking lot, and he was, in fact, gone. I even got outside and did a perimeter check, but no one was there, and I still cannot explain what happened. After the restoration was done, we moved in. My cousin sometimes went on business trips for weeks, and there would just be me in the house. The following happened whenever I was alone. One night I was studying and had my headphones on. I heard sounds of someone walking around in the basement, which was directly below my bedroom. It sounded like they had slippers on, and I could hear the sound of them dragging on the concrete floor with each step. What's weird was that I could not pinpoint exactly which direction in which it was coming from. It's a strange sensation when the sounds were coming from the back of my head, as if they were just right behind me. The only reason that made me think that it's the basement was because the basement was the only area in the house that had concrete and that could have made the concrete slipper dragging sound. So I took out my headphones, and the sounds of the footsteps still went on. The volume of the sounds stayed the same, with or without the headphones. I thought my cousin had come home early, so I called out to him and got no reply. I took the flashlight and went to the basement to check it out. It was dark and quiet. No one else was there. This happened 3 or 4 more times within the first 2 months that I lived in that house. After that, I didn't experience anything unusual anymore. My cousin never felt or saw anything weird, but he seemed interested in my stories. His girlfriend, now wife, who had been to the house every other week or so, also expressed her uneasy feelings during her stays. By 2016, during a thunderstorm, the thunder struck our storage shed in the backyard and burned everything inside it. Luckily, the house was untouched. I came home from work only to find a police officer waiting at the front. He told me what had happened and said that it was an act of God and that our insurance would compensate for the loss. In our Asian culture, people say that when thunder strikes somewhere, often it is to strike down a malevolent force or spirit. We quickly formed the realization that this thunder strike was more than just an accident. I got my own place and moved out a few months after the fire. My cousin bought another house with his wife a year after that. He still owns the creepy house, and it's been left unoccupied since 2017. He plans to tear down the old house and build a larger one to take advantage of the large plot of land. The experiences at this house were the closest I've got to what could be considered paranormal. This happened on a hike up to Half Dome. We had a campground about a 20-minute drive away from the trailhead, and the group was composed of me, an 18-year-old male, my uncle, a 32-year-old male, and my uncle's friend, I'll call him D. There were 2 girls with us, but they aren't relevant to the story. My uncle and his friend are both Christians, so there were no substances consumed that could induce the feelings I will be talking about. We get to our campsite, set up camp, and go to sleep after eating. We plan to wake up at 4 and start to hike by 4:30. I randomly wake up at 3:30 a.m., like completely wide awake, and look out of my hammock, and I remember this odd feeling as if I was woken up by something. I remember looking out at the moonlit scene. The moon was very bright for some reason, and thinking to myself that it looks like a dream. I lay back in the hammock, but can't go to sleep, and end up waking up my uncle and friend at 3:50. My uncle asks me, "Were you walking around at night?" This is important, and I say no and ask why. He says that he woke up for some reason and could hear someone walking around, not like an animal, but a person. I say, weird, and we brush it off. We get to the trailhead around 4:30, and as everyone is unloading from the car, Dee says that he's going to use the bathroom, which there are a couple of before the trailhead. I walk behind him for some time before falling behind and waiting for my uncle, who forgot something in the car. The short, straight road from the parking lot runs directly into a T intersection with the road to the trailhead, and the bathroom is directly across from the intersection through a field a little. Those who have been there know what I'm talking about. We get to the intersection and wait for Dee to come out of the bathroom. We wait about 10 minutes before I go and check, and he isn't there. I get back to my uncle and tell him that. He says, "Weird, maybe he went back to the car or something," and we decide to wait a bit more. By 5:10, we begin worrying. My uncle goes to check the car while I wait at the intersection to make sure that we don't miss him if he went down the road away from the trailhead. My uncle returns and says he isn't there either. We decide maybe he went up the trailhead without us for some reason and walk up in there for about 10 minutes. He isn't there either. We're kind of baffled now because there are no other logical places he would go. I decide to run back and check the car and the bathroom again. I meet him halfway before I get to the intersection. He is sweaty and disheveled with a weird look in his eyes. I say, "Where have you been?" He says that he went to the bathroom, and when he got back to the intersection that we weren't there, and that he just assumed that we went to the trailhead and started walking, and then met me. I say, "What do you mean? We waited at the intersection for over half an hour and checked at the car, bathroom, and trailhead, and you weren't there." He says, "Well, I don't know, I went to the bathroom." He then asks me where my uncle is. I say at the trailhead, and he asks me again. I tell him again and note that it was weird that he was asking me twice. As we were crossing the bridge to the trailhead, he sees a light off the riverbank and exclaims, "Oh, maybe that's him," and I just look at him and keep walking. I thought his behavior was very strange, like he wasn't thinking straight. We finally get on with the hike, and it goes by as normal, except that we seem to keep losing things, such as my uncle's small red flashlight, one of the girl's gloves, a water bottle, etc. It's like we simply just forgot about the items and couldn't remember where we possibly could have left them. On the way back it got dark, and we turned on our flashlights, and as we near the end of the hike after the 2 waterfalls, it begins to seem as if we've been walking for too long. My uncle also confirms this, asking me, "Doesn't it seem like it's taken way longer to get back?" I say, "Yeah, that I was just thinking that." We keep walking, but it still seems like we weren't making any progress. I've been on that trail many times, and as I was walking, I couldn't spot any of the familiar landmarks. It was weird. There was this odd feeling in the air, sort of a slight menacing sensation. It's hard to describe. I remember thinking, it feels like the woods are alive. We remark 3 more times about how long the hike is taking, and start to laugh at it because it felt so ridiculous. After a bit we finally, and suddenly, find ourselves on the final stretch, and make it back to the car. Now all of this seemed odd at the time, but I just brushed it off. I only just realized how weird those events felt after we got home and my aunt asks my uncle, "Were you camping?" And he says, "Yeah, how did you know?" As we didn't tell them we were going, since it was kind of last minute. She said that she had an odd dream where she saw my uncle in a tent in a forest somewhere, and there was someone outside of his tent. She said that she couldn't see who it was, but knew that there was a presence there. She says that she woke up around 3 and had the strongest urge to pray for him, and she did. My uncle kind of looks at me after hearing that like, "Are you serious?" I honestly don't know what to make of all of this. Moving from a small town to a large city at a fairly young age had to be one of the biggest adjustments I've ever had to make. I knew no one. I had no idea how different it really was. I had no reason to think about it before we had to move. Not only was the way of life much different, but so were the people and the experiences. There were so many more buildings, cars, and people in general. And the dangers that lurked only just began to come so real for me. I've always had strange things happen to me that couldn't be explained, but I would always just shrug them off. I would play it off as if I was just tired most times and making myself see things that were not really there. Besides, I had no one to talk to about these strange encounters, and I was a young teenager. Who would really believe these outrageous things that I would just seemingly come up with? The church-going family that we were just wouldn't allow for such nonsense. The Lord protects us from all evil, that kind of jazz. On moving to the city, I eventually got settled after some time of rebelling. I was your normal, typical teenager, and I was angry because I felt like I had been made to leave my friends behind. I got into a lot of trouble and fell into all the wrong crowds. The whole stereotypes that people have of teenagers. I seemed to allow myself to live up to that stereotypical standard. I knew that what I was doing was wrong, but I didn't care. I found myself in some sticky situations that finally led me to a friend that showed me that what I was doing wasn't getting me anywhere with my life. For this story, we'll call him Bob. Bob was an older man. He was, I would say, at least 12 years older than I was. I was 13 at the time that we met. He had moved in downstairs from us with a friend of his that my parents knew. We met while helping his friend move furniture out of his apartment to have his carpets cleaned. Fast forward some time and Bob and I became close friends. Yes, it was odd myself being friends with someone so much older than I was, but somehow it worked at the time. There was this cemetery that was up the street from our apartment complex. We would go there regularly to visit graves and help clean them and place flowers on those that were unmarked to show that someone still cared for these people. We would always go during the day. It was such a beautiful and peaceful place. There were many rose bushes, green grass, tall shrubs, and some really pretty water fountains spread out across this large piece of land. It was easy to just stroll around there all day and lose track of time completely. One day we came upon this one tall mass grave that was unmarked. It was so old that the headstone was crumbling, and the lot that it was on was caving in and had a hole about a foot or so deep just underneath the concrete slab. We were both curious about it and would visit the grave a few times this one week. We weren't sure what it was about this grave that drew us back to it each time, but we visited this person quite often. I can recall this time that we had gone later in the day. It was just an hour or so until it got dark. We were never there when it was dark because they locked the gates, and if they found you there after a certain time, they would kick you out. But they never saw us or bothered to tell us to leave. We were, of course, at this unmarked grave once again. Nighttime had finally fallen, and it was pretty dark. There were a few lights in the cemetery, but it was just a soft glow that filled the area we happened to be at. Bob and I wandered around that unmarked grave and were admiring the other headstones around it. We just couldn't believe how old that they actually were. We ended up circling back, getting ready to head home. We walked back past the unmarked grave to say goodbye. I remember standing there on the side of the grave where the hole was. I was just thinking, how could they not fix this, and wondered how far down that it went. Being the curious idiot that I was, I kneeled down next to this hole and decided to stick my arm into it. It was so deep that you couldn't feel any kind of gravel or soil below. I guess Bob had just kept walking, so there I was with my hand in this hole below this concrete slab. I stood up and went to turn around to walk toward Bob. He was a ways off in the distance, but I could still see him. Before I could take a step, though, I felt like my body wasn't moving. It was as if someone had a huge hold on me. I couldn't move, and I couldn't speak. I was stuck. Bob finally notices me standing where he left me and starts yelling for me to come on, but there was no moving for me, and I felt this grip just getting tighter and tighter. It felt like forever watching as Bob made his way back in my direction, going on about how he wanted to get home, how it was late. He was standing in front of me and looked at me like I'd completely lost it. He had been talking to me and asking me questions, and I, of course, could not move or make a sound. He reaches out to grab me to pull me along, and I didn't budge. As we stood there, he kept talking to me, seemingly thinking that I was messing with him, and he was laughing. Tears began to roll down my face. All I could think about was, how am I going to get this thing to let me go? Did I make it mad? I just kept apologizing in my head, saying how sorry I was for disturbing them, and that if they let me go that I would never bother them again. I'm assuming that they must have known that I was sorry for what I did. I drop to the gravel, and I quickly bolt up and take off running. I ended up leaving Bob behind. He came knocking on my door the next day to ask what happened. I had no idea how to even explain what I had experienced. All I know is that I have never bothered that grave again. I live in the basement of my parents-in-law's house, and my wife never goes down to my room. I'm almost always in there alone. Since I've lived there, a few things have been happening that I dismissed as ventilation or something or other, such as my door slowly creeping open. Frankly, I wouldn't even have noticed something opening if it weren't for the green indicator light of something I have plugged into the wall outside my room. At night, if I have to leave my room, I exit and make an immediate left and dip into the bathroom. I can almost always sense an entity in the living area or bar area of the basement. This feeling is compounded when I exit the bathroom and my reflection appears on the wall of our sliding doors. Sometimes, I do not have a face in my reflection. I quickly re-enter my bedroom and shut and lock the door. Some nights there's a knocking from within my mattress that wakes me up, usually between 3 and 3:15 a.m. I have no way of dealing with this other than risking it and fleeing upstairs to my son's room. My son, 3, has autism and frequently says, "That's scary," over and over in the basement while looking toward the bathroom and living areas. The light switches that I have access to when leaving the room frequently cease to function right when I need them, or will flicker out almost violently as I'm on the staircase halfway up and out of the basement. I can hear rustling in the middle of the night sometimes as well, and I occasionally convince myself that it's just a mouse. Lately, this has graduated to the sound of footsteps in the ceiling in the middle of the night. Most recently, when I heard these footsteps, there was no one home but me, and I searched the house wielding a knife for an intruder to find no one home. I think that this entity is aware that I know it exists, and I interacted with it via the mirror once, and it contorted my face. I have a story from about 2 years ago that really captivates me to this day. When I've told this story to close friends, they tell me it's straight out of a movie. I can't really disagree with that. This starts when I finished my first year of college in the Bay Area. I worked my ass off in school and I just wanted to have a wild summer, and I would do anything I could to get out of the house. My cousin was and is my best friend, and we basically did anything and everything together. When there wasn't anything to do, we'd take walks together around my rural neighborhood. I always lived near this old hospital, which used to operate as the biggest trauma unit in my area. Sometime when I was in high school, they shut the hospital down for some reason that I still don't know. It basically just sat there rotting for a few years before we found it. One day, we were drinking a cold one and taking one of our routine walks and ventured away from our usual route through this peaceful, random field. We stumbled across this huge parking lot after making it out of the field, but it didn't hit me that this was the old hospital's parking lot that we had found. We made our way through the lot until we saw this massive building standing on the outside. The deteriorated banner said emergency room, and this was when we knew we had struck gold and stumbled across a back route to this abandoned hospital. We knew of this place, but we had never been here. We hadn't heard any weird, outlandish urban legends, nor had anyone that we knew been here before us. We pushed forward and checked out the perimeter. To our surprise, the first door we walked up to had a rock jammed in between the door frames so that we could just waltz right in. This was when it occurred to us that it could be a potentially bad idea if we got caught, and we could suffer some consequences. We agreed we would be quiet and respectful and make it a quick trip. This is where things take a turn. Or a few turns. We entered the building and it was the most deafening quiet that I had ever experienced. The sound of the door closing was like a literal bomb going off. Once the echo stopped from the door, it dawned on us that this place was straight up creepy. We walked slowly, but the floor is covered in glass, which makes even the smallest of steps sound like Bigfoot lumbering around a library. We found a patient room, which still had a bed inside. We stopped at the doorway to look in because the floor looked sketchy. Out of nowhere, from around the corner, we heard the faintest, slow, drawn-out whistling. I've never in my life stopped what I was doing so suddenly. I just stared wide-eyed at my cousin because even a whisper sounds like yelling in this place. We both have our feet planted to the ground, because if we move, then we too will make ourselves known. At this point, we both assumed there could potentially be a squatter or a guard of some sort. My cousin hand gestures to me that we have to leave and we can't just stand here because the whistling was obviously not going to stop. We turn toward the opposite of the corner that the whistling is at, and we're tiptoeing to a perfect silence. Then the whistling stopped. We freeze again, and we hear the glass crunching from around the corner. We start running. Once we get to the door we came from, we realize we didn't put a fucking rock in the door frame when we came in, and now the door is completely stuck. As we were trying to get this door open, the glass crunching is now running. We hear it until it sounds like it is dangerously close. I am horrified. We turn around to try another door and the noise of the glass is literally right in front of us. Yet no one is there. No one. We book it to a door that says pharmacy and peel the door open. The pharmacy is completely empty except a single, perfectly placed and aligned landline phone plugged into the wall. The phone is off the hook and making a dial tone. The whole thing is so perfectly lined up and centered with the whole room, I've never seen anything like it. And the dial tone was so loud in such an empty place. There wasn't power throughout the hospital, so how was it working? I was in complete shock. We left and never went back. I had heard of some other kids going there at night. They told me that they also heard the whistling and thought someone was lurking in the shadows the whole time. It is a freaky world out there. This was a pretty surreal experience for me, and the few people that I've told agreed that perhaps someone was watching over me and warning me. A couple of years ago, I lived in a place close to the sea. At night, I used to take my dog down through the town center to the seafront for a nice walk. I eventually discovered that there was a small graveyard with gates on either side which I could cut through. I kind of like walking through graveyards, especially at night, because it is creepy in a very cool kind of way. I did this quite a lot, and never once felt afraid. However, one night I was walking up to the gates and I felt the strongest feeling of dread. No reason for it. Nothing was different. But it was like something was screaming at me to not go through. Do not walk through the graveyard tonight. I didn't. I turned around and went the other way. It was such a bizarre sensation, given that before I had walked there plenty of times without meeting anyone, with nothing happening. I genuinely believe that if I had ignored that and walked on through, something would have happened. Who knows what, or what was lurking there that night. I never went that way again. Some people have told me that I had a guardian angel who was warning me of the danger. I grew up in rural Oregon with around 70 acres of wooded private property as my personal playground. By the time I was 16, I had spent countless hours exploring every square foot that I could, and had never experienced anything any more unpleasant than poison oak and more than a few blackberry scratches. Oddly, there was one small portion of the property that I had never checked out. I couldn't tell you why I had never gone to this one little corner. I just never did. It was like an unconscious choice to just never go there. There was even an old trail or road leading back to it. One afternoon, I got the itch to turn left and follow that trail. The day was bright and warm. Nothing was sketchy or untoward. However, within 50 feet of the trailhead, I felt an overwhelming need to stop in my tracks. It was like stepping on a giant, sticky mouse trap. My feet simply wouldn't carry me any further forward. As I stood there, every hair on my body stood on end, and I felt absolutely sick to my stomach with dread. I spun in place, looking every direction for whatever danger my body was telling me was there. The spot where I stood was a bit of a clearing in the trees. I had about 20 feet or so of total visibility in all directions, and further in some. There was nothing, not so much as a bird or a bug. I've never felt such utter terror and the desire to go full knees to chest for the hills. I made my way back to the trailhead as fast as I could backpedal, and the second my feet left the trail, it all faded. Hairs back down, stomach settled, and zero sense of unease. It was like stepping out of a room and closing the door. For years I wondered what kind of presence I had encountered. Many naysayers tried to tell me that it was probably just a cougar and it was my sixth sense picking up on it. I wasn't buying it. Then, in talking to my parents one day, who used to wander that property when they were dating a few decades ago, I found out that they had come across the remnants of an old homestead there. It had deteriorated to the point where there was nothing left but the outline of the foundation and some old medicine bottles. I had a light bulb moment. Seems that maybe one of the homesteaders was still there, and I was definitely trespassing. I've had short-lived moments of temptation where I thought about going back there and seeing if I could replicate the experience. In all honesty, though, whatever was there was way too dark for me to ever want to encounter it again. It definitely seems best left alone. I live near one of the oldest cemeteries in Portland, Oregon. It's pioneer era. The oldest graves are from the 1850s, and it's still active today, funerals all the time. Anyway, I go walk and jog through there pretty often. I usually jog a couple miles, and then finish up with some wind sprints. There's a spot where it's straight for about 60 or 70 yards, so I'll do 8 or 10 of these things and then quit. The spot where I usually start running from is right near the grave of a young boy who was born in 1896 and died in 1902. I've done some research, and all of his family is actually buried in a different cemetery, so I always feel a little sad about it. His name is Carl, and it's weird maybe, but I talk to the kid's grave as I'm resting up between sprints. For whatever reason, that's the only grave in there that I've ever paid much attention to, and about the only one that I'd ever done any research on. Not sure why exactly. A couple weeks ago on Wednesday, I was doing my thing. I stopped at my normal spot, said hi to Carl, and instantly got this sickening feeling that I was in danger. I looked up at this tree, big old oak, branches around 1.5 feet in diameter. I was absolutely terrified, and I started running and got the hell out of the way. I was absolutely 100% sure that this branch was going to fall and kill me. I waited a few minutes, and came back over and started looking at this big oak tree and the horse chestnut right beside it. I couldn't decide which tree actually was going to fall, so I sort of blew it off as paranoia. Not really a credible premonition or whatever. The next day, on Thursday, I go for a run, avoiding that area. When I finished up, I went back and stopped next to Carl's grave. It was a little later than I usually go, mid-afternoon, and it's getting pretty hot out, so I wasn't really looking forward to running more. I didn't actually hear anything, but something told me you shouldn't go any further. So it's hot, I'm tired, I'm paranoid. I noped out and went home. The next day, it's Friday. I go back into the cemetery. A massive branch from the oak tree had fallen, knocked about 5 branches off of the horse chestnut. It all landed on Carl's grave and right on the part of the path that I usually jog on. Some parks workers were already cutting the trees up to clear the way. I asked one guy when it had fallen, and he said it had happened sometime on Thursday afternoon. I have no idea if I actually would have been there at that time at that spot, but it was weird enough to freak me out a little bit. Anyway, thanks, Carl. I'd like to start this off by saying that I'm an absolute skeptic, to the point where I've always secretly scoffed about paranormal activities. But I can't explain this. I met my husband in a little dive bar that he was managing. We clicked instantly, and he's a very outdoorsy guy. We got together a couple times, then he officially asked me out on an overnight hike. I had a 10-month-old St. Bernard pup, who of course came with. We drove up way past Cougar towards Mount St. Helens and parked on the trailhead leading to Bolt Camp. It's just a little shelter along the Lewis River about 5 to 6 miles in. We packed all our gear, and even a backpack for my dog, and headed out. I can't stress how beautiful that hike is. Massive Douglas firs covered with moss. Sometimes there were little wooden bridges crossing streams along the trail. My husband would always yell, "Watch out for trolls," when we crossed them. We got kind of a late start, so the sun went down, and it was almost completely dark by the time that we arrived. There were so many hollow stumps the setting sun would shine through them, and they lit up inside. They looked like little hobbit houses with fires burning in their hearths. And the mushrooms, my God, there were bioluminescent ones that glowed green in the dark. It took forever. He kept saying that it was around the next bend, but it never was. We finally arrived and unpacked, and it was awesome. You can look up Bolt Camp online. It's a wooden 3-sided shelter. You'll even see my saint in one of those pics. A tree had come down on it at some point, and the pics you see of it partially smashed are how it was for us. It was still more than intact enough to sleep in, though. People leave stuff at Bolt Camp for the next folks. Someone had left half a bottle of scotch. We partook in that, and when we left, we hung a little baggie of weed from the rafters, and some beer and water. Anyway, we made a fire and cooked steaks on rocks, got drunk, and fell in love. I fell asleep first. I slept towards the inside of the shelter, my now husband and dog toward the outside. It was late October, and while it was dry, it was very, very cold, and the fire refused to stay lit. Eventually, he fell asleep too. My Saint Leo kept growling into the dark, and they bonded over that. "What do you see, buddy? What's out there?" They were both asleep when I woke up. Thinking it was around 2:30 to 3 a.m., I was facing the back wall of the shelter. Then I saw it. A wispy, gossamer, cobweb-looking thing floating to and fro in the back of the shelter. It would flip and spin and turn over itself. It was so beautiful and fascinating. I wasn't scared. I really, really wanted to wake him up, but I barely knew the dude and was afraid he would think I was nuts. So I watched it until I fell asleep. Morning came. I never mentioned it. We fed the dog, ate a bunch of trail mix and cheese and sausage, and hiked back. I dropped him off at his place. Like I said, we fell in love that night, and moved in together a couple months later. We were reminiscing about our awesome hike when he decided to share something with me. I dropped him off that day at his house. That same evening, he was out on his porch having a smoke when he saw something. A cobwebby thing, turning over and over on itself, floating back and forth in the street lamps. He found this interesting. He watched it, and finally it settled into a clump of bushes. He went to take a closer look, and a pair of glowing red eyes materialized, and he decided that he wanted no part, and ran back indoors. This is a man afraid of nothing. Anyway, I obviously immediately told him about what I had seen, and how I was too embarrassed to share before. The similarities are just too great. It had to have been the same thing. When I was growing up, there had been a few forests around town that had famous stories linked to them. The people believed that the forests were cursed from the Native American tribes who were relocated from their homes way back when. They said that the forests belonged to them, and when you go in and ignore your gut feeling, those people die in those woods. When my dad and my sister and I moved when I was around 13 or so, we moved to a small town. Across the street was a hill, and at the top stood a blue water tower. I used to hang out in the woods across the street from my house. It was quiet, and the birds always chirped. Other kids were scared of the woods, but I went up there to draw and listen to the birds. Also, because it was at the top of a hill, I could look out and see the entire town and feel the breeze. But when the animals went quiet, it was time to go. When the school year started, I found out that it was an ancient Indian burial ground. Every year our class would go up the hill and learn about it, and the town and the school was actually really respectful of the forest and the hill. We took care of the trees there. If you looked at the ground, you could still see a lot of Native American arrowheads. We never took them home, though, and were not supposed to. I didn't, at least. I would actually go into the forest when I was walking home because the bullies were too scared to go in. I felt safe there, but I also had to remember to respect it. In the forest, we also had wood piles. When we would go into the forest, we would make piles for the local foxes to nest in during the winter time. Once I went to school after retreating into the forest from one of my bullies the other day. A couple of my classmates ran up to me and said, "What did you do, Jacob?" I looked at the kid and said, "Nothing, why?" They looked at each other and said, "Well, something scared him, and we thought you had scared him, in the woods." I said, "I didn't scare him, I just went in there to hang out." It was the time that Jacob threw a rock at me, and I remember it landed to my right, and I hurried up my pace in the woods, and I thought that he had left at that point, like he always did. He screamed "raccoon" at me, and when I reached the top of the hill, I cried and went home because for some reason that time the bullying hurt. Whatever happened to Jacob in the woods, I'll never know. He stopped bullying me from that day forward, and said sorry to me, and that it would never happen again. He did say something happened in the woods, but he never said by what or who. Just had a look of terror and practically begged me to accept his apology. I told him it's all right, and I went on my way. He could never look me in the eye again. That was back in middle school. When I went to college, I saw him at a 4th of July college event. I was going to catch up with him about life and put the bullying behind us. He glanced, but still looked so uneasy that I simply walked by. Also, sometimes my sister would walk home with me after school. Only once or twice that I can recall. Every time we entered the woods, she felt lost. I even had her lead us, and she couldn't follow the trail. It's like she kept seeing these invisible trails that went in circles. She started to breathe heavy and cry and said we were lost, and she had an anxiety attack and just told me that we had to get out of the woods. I was totally chill, and knew the forest pretty well, and I let us out, and it was easy. It was literally just 3 trails, one from the south, one from the north, and one going up the hill to our house. You could get in and out of the forest in under 10 minutes, from one side to the other. I live in Massachusetts, and there's a location out here called Belchertown State School for the feeble-minded. Check it out on Wikipedia and Google some pictures. It's pretty neat stuff. Well, it has a very dark history with ill treatment of patients, including children, and reported suicides. Closed in 1992. It was mostly demolished in late 2016 into 2017, but before that, I spent about a year going there on a weekly basis, usually Fridays. I began with a few friends, and then over time, I would go there alone. I spent a lot of time on those grounds to the point where I knew every part of it, inside and out. I even became something of a local legend because I wore a mask when exploring, and if I ran into other groups, they would recognize me from stories. There's a few selfies out there of me with some folks, too. People like taking pictures. Never saw any of those selfies, though, sadly. But there were many nights when I had the whole grounds to myself. Paranormal activity was rampant, and I have some crazy stories. The most obvious and frequent one was the noises. Now, mind you, the whole of the complex was in disrepair. Not only that, but wild animals would sometimes move in and out of the location, so there were a lot of unidentified noises that I could likely attribute to animals. I'm a firm believer in the paranormal, but I do try to approach all things as a skeptic before jumping to potential conclusions. A few things I absolutely could not explain. One was the X door. There was one door in the hospital, on the 3rd floor, right wing, 2nd door into the floor, on the left. It was beside what once was a bathroom. This door led to a hall containing several empty rooms, and I could not determine what these rooms might have been. They didn't look like cells, more like office or storage spaces. I'm a pretty stocky 6-foot dude, and I had to lean into this door. I call it the X door because it was the only door in the whole facility marked with a spray-painted orange X on it. Imaginative name, I know. This door was a highlight for my personal trips as well as when I went with groups. 'Cause we would close the door, walk away, and later come back to find it open. It's possible that some animal managed to open it, as unlikely as that is. What was more unlikely were the times we left it open, and when we came back about 10 minutes later, it was closed. I tried when alone to sit and watch the door, but nothing happened. I tried to replicate potential causes, but there was zero airflow in this wing due to heavy doors on all the other sides, and honestly, if an animal did get in, It could not have been bigger than a rat due to there being so little open space to move in this particular segment. I could never explain the X-door, but it's always a good stun when I bring a group back up to that floor and we would find the door had shifted. Another experience was one time when I was bringing 2 of my friends out there. It was their first trip to the grounds. We made it in past the fence and to the outside of the asylum. They didn't want to go in, already getting spooked. I encouraged them to try it. It had some cool stuff to see after all. Then we all 3 at the same time heard what sounded like screaming, laughter, and talking all at once. I heard more laughter, but my friends said that the screaming was most prominent. Now it could have been another group inside the hospital building, but here's the thing. I have been on the grounds when another group is talking or laughing or screaming inside. You can pinpoint exactly where it goes down. There was lots of broken windows and open walls, so it was pretty damn easy to lock down any sound and where it was coming from. But this sound came from the building. That's the only way I can explain it. Like the whole building at once just let loose a scream of trapped noises. I'm a gutsy bloke, but I got chills. We left after that to the begging of my friends to flee the grounds. I wish I could have stayed that night. The activity was just getting started, I feel. I would go there weekly and spend about a half hour in several key rooms. The padded room, the silent room, the X room, the auditorium, and gym. There were lots of great sounds and some truly disturbing sensations. I'm married with 3 kids. The kids are older, 20, 17, and 10. We just bought a house and moved in the first week of December. Our room and my daughter's rooms are upstairs, and my 20-year-old son has a room in the basement. There's a storage room across from his room, then a big area with a fireplace where I have my gaming console, TV, and chair set up. Anyhow, on Christmas Day, the wife and kids were getting ready to go to her dad's house. I wasn't going because me and her dad didn't get along. I fire up the PlayStation in the basement and put on my headset. They're all upstairs running around because they're going to be late, and I see my son come downstairs and head into his room to grab something. A few minutes go by and I'm focusing on my game. Out of the corner of my eye, I see what I thought was my son leave his room and walk into the storage room, then slam the door hard and loud enough that I hear it through my noise-canceling headset. I pull off my headset and yell, "What the hell, man?" and look over at the storage room. The house is quiet. I walk over and open the storage room door. It's a 10 by 10 room with no windows and nothing in it. I look in his room, but he's not in there. I go upstairs, and they've already left. The van is gone. I told my wife about it, and she just laughed. Funny thing is, I never mentioned it to my son, but the other day I came home from work and he says, "Damn, Dad, I could hear you in the gaming room until like 4 a.m. I'm surprised you made it to work this morning." Me and all the girls had gone to bed by 9 p.m. the night before. I was with my niece, who's on her high school soccer team and is taking it pretty serious and attempting to get some kind of scholarship out of it. I'm pretty healthy, but don't really work out too much. Something I often do is run and hike. I live in Kentucky, not in a rural part, but there is a state park near my house that's about 6,500 acres, so it's pretty secluded and densely forested. There are some really nice trails that allow you to run for a good chunk and then hike for a bit to split up the long bits of the trail that are flat. She decided to tag along with me today for a quick 3 or 4 mile run. It was raining, but nothing too heavy, kind of a spitting rain. Nothing we couldn't handle. We got up to the peak of this one hill, and it had been about 2 miles or so according to our phones, so we decided to turn back and head back to the car. As we were headed down the steep side of the climb, we were walking pretty slow, making sure that we didn't lose our footing, when out of nowhere there was the coldest chill that came up from behind us once we made it about halfway down. At the time it happened, we both commented on how cold it was on our backs, but didn't make too much out of it and went on with our conversation. In these woods there's some wildlife like small deer and I believe maybe some coyotes, but they tend to stay away from the paths. At least I've only ever heard them in my many years of coming here, never once seen any more than a few footprints. Once we got off of the hillside and hit a stretch of trail that was flatter ground, we began to pick up the pace when a deer darted across the path maybe 10 yards max in front of us, causing us to stop in our tracks. The first deer was then followed by 3 more, and not one of them even so much as looked our way. My niece looked at me puzzled because of the oddity of it. And to me, they were acting as if they were running from something, a predator of some sort. Once they had gone, we started back with our run, and we heard a noise behind us. A loud booming sound of something of substance falling to the ground from some height. When we stopped and turned, we saw nothing. No animal scurrying away like one would expect after a substantial noise in the wilderness. In fact, everything was calm, eerily calm. Just as we looked at each other to ask what the hell that had been, there was yet another cold wind gush through the valley, pushing all the rain off the leaves surrounding us and soaking our sweatshirts. I was starting to freak out inside, but was doing my best to stay calm for my 17-year-old niece. I'm pretty sure she could tell, though, that I was freaked out. I tell her, "Come on, let's get to the car." And we take off again, and there was a man leaned up against a tree on the side of the trail, dressed in a black suit with a white button-up shirt on. His collar was opened, but he had a tie on, sagging like a tired businessman on the way home from a long day. It startled me at first. I was not expecting to see anyone for a few reasons, one being that we were at least a mile away from any parking lot or street, another being that we had never heard or seen him coming, and the stretch of trail that we were on was flat and open for a good half-mile. I got over to put myself between the man and my niece as we jogged past him. When we did, I looked him in the eye and gave him a "how you doing" nod as we went along. He was sort of pale. His eyes were very white, but his irises were ice blue. Everything I saw from the quick look that I got close up looked to be clean-cut and proper. I did not notice a speck of mud on him anywhere, and the two of us had it caked on the bottom of our shoes and even on the back of our pants and shirts from kicking it up on us as we ran. We had to get to the top of another hill, smaller than the last, but still quite the hike. Once at the top, I took a quick look behind us, and he had seemed to vanish without a trace. Now, with having the vantage point of the hill, I could see out past the trail and see most of the trail that she and I had just come from, yet he was nowhere in sight. I scanned the sides of the trail, and still nothing. My niece asked me who that guy was and why he was out so deep in the woods wearing a suit. Questions I simply did not have the answers to. We made it back to the car with nothing else out of the ordinary happening to us on the trail. As we got to my car, I pulled the keys from my pocket and unlocked the doors from maybe about 10 feet out. Walking up to the only car in the entire lot, I noticed muddy footprints coming away from my car from the driver's side. Weird, considering I had no mud on my shoes when we got there. But there are trails leading up to the lot, so I figured maybe someone had came through before we got there and I just didn't notice. However, when I pulled the handle to open the door, it was also caked with mud underneath, as if someone had been attempting to open my door with a muddy hand. Nothing more occurred, but the whole encounter leaves chills covering my body the more I think about it. I was driving with my daughter from Atlanta to South Carolina, and we were about 30 minutes away from home. I was very familiar with the area because I've traveled there countless times. As we passed by a church, my daughter said, "Did you see that lady?" I'm like, "What lady?" She explained that there was a woman walking among the tombstones in the graveyard. I'm like, "Let me turn around and see." Now, I had gone just a minute or so down the road before I turned around so that I was sure to see her. As we got to the church, I slowed down, almost to the point of stopping, and there was no one. I turned around and actually stopped in front of the graveyard, and nobody was there. Now, this church was very isolated. There were no other houses for at least a mile or two. We didn't see any cars that might have been broken down, and there were woods to the back of the church. Like I said, I know this area, so we think that it was the spirit of a woman who was buried there. You have to ask yourself, why in the hell would a woman be walking around in a graveyard at 3 a.m. in the morning? No houses for miles, no disabled car. Very spooky. By the way, my daughter sees spirits, and she's an empath. This happened to me back in 2008 when I was 14, so my memory is a little fuzzy. My mom, brother, and I drove deep into the sticks of Tennessee from Texas to visit. We were only staying for the weekend. My mom, aunt, and grandmother were talking, and I don't know how we got to this conversation, but my aunt was telling me how she heard about this abandoned church that was supposedly haunted. If you went to the church and took the stick that kept the door closed and put it somewhere else, when you came back, it would be in its original place. There was a statue of an angel, and if you shined a light in its eyes at night, they would bleed. She was spending the night at a friend's house, and her friend also had another friend over that she wasn't familiar with. Her two friends decided to go out to this church at night, in the early hours of the morning. It was pitch black because it's out in the country. They lay a Ouija board on the truck and start asking questions. Basically, some spirit named John says that he was murdered by a gunshot some year in the early 1800s. I swear in this town there are more dead people than there are alive people. I don't actually know that, but it sure seems like it. The last question that they asked was, "Where are you?" And the planchette flew off the board. They decided they didn't want to look for it. Part of me wonders if it's still at the church and where it would be. So they checked the gravestones nearby and found John. Then they thought that they heard a gunshot and ran back to the truck and went home. I said I wanted to go to the church. She took me, my brother, and my cousin who were the same age. It was about a 45-minute drive to get there, and the road that it was on was empty, nothing but grass. There was no way that you could walk there. Across the street was a field that went on for miles, and on either side of the church was just grass and trees. No streetlights. So when we get there, it's a one-room, white, little church. It's surrounded by trees toward the outside of the fence. The fence was black iron, and the opening was big enough for trucks to come through. We saw the creepy angel statue that my aunt had mentioned. We thought it looked like the Reaper. We pull up, and the gate is already open. Immediately, my brother and my cousin, who were in the back seat, were like, "Oh no, we are not going in there." And my aunt was saying, "Why is the gate open? I just don't understand." And I had my hand on the handle, and I looked at the gate. And I knew that something was waiting for me on the other side. I could see, maybe my mind made it up, but I didn't see it with my physical eyes. A ghostly white man with yellow, crooked teeth maliciously smiling at me. So I take my hand off the handle and say, "Okay, I want to go home." So my aunt backed out and went down the road a little bit further, and the closest thing next to us to turn around at, because there were little ditches on the side of the road in case it rains, was another graveyard. Not surprising. We passed by the church, and I wasn't expecting her to stop, but she did to take a photo with a digital camera, and the door was open to the church. We were all freaked out, and I swear I had this feeling like we needed to leave because something was going to chase us. When we got home, the three of us couldn't stop looking at the camera. The thing I remembered the most was that the treetops grew into a face. It looked like a big bald man with a crooked nose and a narrow chin. When my aunt got the picture developed, there were 4 orbs. 1 by the gate, 1 by the door, and 2 by the window. My brother and cousin swore that they had seen green eyes looking out of that window. I didn't sleep that night. I felt like something was hovering over me, waiting for me to fall asleep. I kept praying that nothing would happen. I tried watching TV to shake it off, but damn, there was no shaking it. I didn't sleep until I got back to Texas. That was my last night in Tennessee, and when I went back home, I slept with my light on every night for a while. And while we were there, I could just sense this unbelievable amount of hate from whatever was there. It was so aggressive and ready to attack. That feeling just pierced through you. That's my only experience. I will never doubt that there is a spirit world after that. My aunt sent me the picture, but I tore it up in 2012 because I was afraid that it would bring something bad into the house. I went ghost hunting with a friend at Rolling Hills Asylum in East Bethany, New York. The whole operation of ghost hunting at this place is actually pretty interesting. They give you a quick tour and let you go around hunting on your own, allowing you to bring your own equipment, rent theirs, or sometimes borrow theirs. Now, there is a fairly large amount of people, but plenty of ground to cover, so it was rare to be bunched up too much. But we always kept in mind others when investigating on our own. Primarily, the equipment that I was using was pretty mundane. Flashlights, audio recording on a Samsung Galaxy S6, and a Nikon Coolpix. Rolling Hills used to be a poorhouse near Batavia, New York. It is located in pretty much the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but fields. Outside disturbances are minimal, which is great. The place is old, no doubt. Bugs get in, and field mice and rats are no doubt common. The grounds took in people with mental disabilities, the physically ill, the poor, and later it served as a senior living facility. There are a few famous resident spirits, but during our interactions we caught no evidence from those areas. We're very objective and scientific with our investigations, and for some reason do not get creeped out by much. I can safely tell you that we did not have any feelings of a presence or the like. Our first start was the shadow hallway. This hall is famous for shadow beings peeking out from the doors down the hall, as well as pushing people in wheelchairs, and your run-of-the-mill terrors. Additionally, the portal room was on this level. We experienced 3 events in this hall. 1. While not our experiment, a group of people had a flashlight that uses a twist motion to turn on. While barely having it on, they asked the spirits questions. The flashlight, much to my surprise, flashed with responses accurately. While this was not my flashlight, I am convinced that it was legitimate. I took several photos of the area and captured nothing of note. 2. A loud bang came from a bathroom nearby. My friend and I immediately went inside to investigate, taking photos. While we caught nothing, others nearby said that they had heard a bang from that room as well earlier. This could be explained by the building's age, but nevertheless, it was still interesting. 3. We thought we heard footsteps coming down the hall, but we did not record any sounds on the audio device, so I cannot say that this was 100% legitimate. The next location that we experienced an event in was a small building attached via tunnel to the main building. My friend, who is extremely skeptical, always brings this situation up when talking about the experience. We were standing in the building right in the middle. They say that there was a boy who liked to hear songs. So, as I was about to chime in my best pirate shanty, don't ask, we heard a knock on a large wooden door behind us. Okay, I know that you're probably thinking that someone was on the other side of that door. Well, that door is out in the field, and we were extremely quiet in that room. There was no window for someone in the next room to look through. The door was a large, sliding wooden door that was sealed. He thinks it was the best experience there. Shortly after the door knock, something made a noise almost like an object falling on the opposite side of the room. While my friend investigated the door, I investigated the noises across the room. There were no people anywhere near us at that time, but something could have fallen. The rest of the building was fairly tame, and I enjoyed the experience. I may go sometime again, but next time shell out the cash to make it a private event. I am far too worried about individuals ruining evidence, or worse, causing false positives. I will preface this by saying that I think I'm silly to believe in ghosts, and I get embarrassed to speak about it. The alternative to believing that I was haunted is admitting that I am much more mentally ill than I had ever believed, which is absolutely possible. This took place over a few years in a farmhouse in the desert of Arizona. It was newly developed land. We moved into the place when I was 15. At the time, I was going through a lot emotionally, and smoking a lot of weed. That might explain some of my personal experiences, so I'll try not to dwell on them too much. The house was set up almost plantation style. It was very wide, had a big wraparound porch, and lots of awkward corners. The front room was a tall library, with an open balcony to the upstairs, which ran into long, skinny bedrooms. My parents' room was closest to the stairs and was attached to a nursery with a sliding ensuite door. My brother's rooms, who were 2 years younger than me, and my room were at the end of a dark hallway. That side of the house never got sun, so it had bad vibes all around. Downstairs, there was a messed up Harry Potter-style closet, a sunken-in living room, a kitchen in the center of the house, and a sunken playroom for the baby. It honestly started the first day that we moved in. My brother and I were the only ones in the house, and we were unboxing plates. It was so empty that everything in there echoed. I swear it sounded like a little girl laughed, like a creepy track that you could get off of an app or something. Keep in mind, the TVs were not plugged in. We were on an acre of land, far away from the dirt road, and my brother was way too stupid to pull a prank like that. I started hearing voices at night. This wasn't unusual. I honestly used to freak myself out so badly that I think I made noises up to scare myself. My parents had raised me not to talk about things scaring me, to tough it out and be a big girl. It was fine most of the time during the day. Everything bad came at night. I remember distinctly when it started messing with me in bed. In solidarity, my brother and I kept our bedroom doors open for the hallway's nightlight, and in case we needed to call for each other. We had a pretty messed up childhood that might have contributed to all the codependency I'll describe during this. I was falling asleep, but not quite out. I felt the blanket slipping off the bed and reached down to grab it. This was common. I didn't have a bed frame with a foot. It kept slipping no matter how I tried to tuck it. In classic horror movie fashion, the last time I pulled it, I felt tension. There was nothing it could have been caught on. I felt like the second I went from confused to terrified, it bounced back to me. I don't know how to explain this that well, but I was certain that someone was under the bed pulling it away from me. Later, I moved another nightlight into the bedroom. It was a kind of spooky amber orange, and I convinced my parents to let me paint the walls cherry red. Again, I was almost asleep, but not quite out, so I don't think it could have been sleep paralysis. I heard the carpet rustle, and maybe joints cracking. It sounded like my mom had come in to check on me. I opened my eyes, and immediately froze. I don't think I've ever been more scared in my life. There was a woman crawling across my floor from the far side of my room to the foot of my bed. She was pale and stringy-haired as if she were going bald. I couldn't see her face. I don't know how I fell asleep. I couldn't scream or move. I think she disappeared under my bed. But again, this could always be a hallucination. My baby brother was about 7 months old when she started coming out during the day. My mom was a teacher at the time and was able to stay home with us during summer vacation. It was lunchtime and we were watching a movie quietly downstairs while the baby napped. There were noises upstairs, as if something had been dropped to the ground. We listened for a second before my mom ran up. She thought the baby had fallen out of his crib. We opened the door and found him sound asleep. There was weird white stuff on the floor. It took us a while to figure out that it was drywall or something like that. There was a crawl space to a small attic where the AC and insulation could be reached. It was barely big enough to get into and a good 9 feet from the ground. It also had to be pushed up and slid over to open. There was a visible gap. The carpet was a really ugly dark blue, so we could see the white spots on the ground as if something had been dragged from one side of the room to where the crib was, and it stopped right in front of it. My mom checked the closet and called my stepdad. He couldn't leave work, so he stayed downstairs until he got home and checked the crawl space. We have never had animals. It's really difficult for most things to live in Arizona, so wildlife is pretty rare in that area. He didn't find anything, or signs of anything living up there. This happened every other day for 2 weeks. We really didn't know what to make of it. My mom thought it might be the AC suctioning the opening upward. It stopped and didn't happen again for 2.5 years, until my baby sister was born and stayed in the same crib. Again, it happened on and off for a few weeks, and never again. To keep my own solo experiences brief, I had a period of 3 months where I straight up did not sleep. I went crazy. Every night, I felt like my bed was shaking. The instant I laid my head down, it would vibrate, the metal frame would sway, and I would feel as if something was pushing the mattress between the baseboards or sitting on the corner. I had my brother touch the frame one night to tell me if the shaking was in my head or not. He said it wasn't, but I'm still not sure if he wasn't just playing into it. I thought I might be having seizures or something. At one point I got so frustrated I started sleeping on the couch downstairs with the dog. I started hearing whispers too. Not a noise that sounded odd, but someone calling my name. My name has 3 freaking syllables. I would be in my room, door open, doing something at night after my parents went to bed. It was a female voice, but it sounded off. I don't know how to explain it. The downstairs really scared me after the lights went out, so I never went down, but I did walk to the balcony and look. I never saw anything, but the whispering would stop when I got close. My brother started hearing it too. He's kind of weird. His life's dream has been enlisting in the army, so his reaction was always getting his knife and walking right downstairs to confront it. He would turn the lights on and look around before coming right back up. He slept on my floor a few nights because he was convinced that she wanted me. We had prior haunting experiences, which led to my parents making jokes that the ghosts follow us. They didn't pay much attention to it at the time when it was quiet. One night my parents went out with the babies. My brother and I were in our rooms, doors open per usual. We started hearing something strange. At first, I thought it was the wind. It got louder until it was clear that a woman was wailing. I know it sounds crazy, but it was so clear. We hid in my room for what felt like hours, calling my mom. For some reason, it never occurred to us to call the police. Eventually, the crying stopped. We hatched a plan to run for the stairs and out the nearest door. All of the lights were on in the house, and my brother has his stupid knives. It's like it knew that we were going to leave. We heard shuffling outside the door, and maybe breathing? I guess it could have been the air conditioning. We kind of decided that we were ready to die, unlocked the door, and booked it. The crying started again, and it was very clear that it was coming from my parents' room. We stood outside the property line for another hour waiting for them to arrive, watching the house. No one could have gotten out without us seeing. We had huge windows lining the upstairs hallway that showed everything with the lights on. My parents again made fun of us, and still do about that night. A few other incidents include my baby brother talking to the man upstairs. He would stand in front of the balcony and chat up to someone. He told us that the man was hiding in my room. He talked about the man in the window and would ask, "Who's that?" directed to the doors at night. I don't want to talk about all of it, but there were so many instances of voices, doors slamming, and things being knocked over in my room that I really did think I was losing my mind. I moved out at 18 and came back occasionally, usually to babysit. Apparently, my reluctant believer mother and absolute skeptic stepdad watched a coffee pot jump off of the counter. They were also outside sitting and having an open fire while drinking a coffee when they saw a figure in the balcony window of our room. It was a tall man, but my stepdad still needed urging to go upstairs. It appeared a second time, closer to where the nursery door was. My mom said she had horrible dreams about a man in the corner of her room after that. She was present for many of the instances where we heard footsteps upstairs, doors slamming when the AC was off, etc., but she always denied that there was anything wrong. Once my parents left town with the kids for a week. At this point I was 19 and living happily an hour away. My mom begged me to check on my brother and stay a few nights for the weekend. I arrived during the evening after I got off of work. I asked how had things been when he was alone. He said he was fine, he just didn't go upstairs at night and, quote-unquote, minded his business. He said if he ignored it and tried not to get scared, then it in return ignored him. He felt safe with the dog. We were watching YouTube and eating when we started to hear a deep noise. At first I thought it was a bike or one of the small buggies that people drove out here. Then I noticed that it was holding a tune. It was humming. The dog had a weird thing about staring into the bathroom if the door was open, which is scary at night. This time, the door was closed, and he still stood up and stared. The noise was so deep that it sounded as if it couldn't have been human, but it was definitely melodic. There's nothing I could think to figure out to try and explain it. My brother and I just kind of looked at each other. Then, a door slammed upstairs, and we decided to nope out of there and go for a walk. When we got back, I decided that I would sleep in my parents' room. It didn't feel right to stay in the kids' room, but looking back, it would have been best to stay close to my brother. I fell asleep surprisingly easy. I guess about 2 hours passed before my brother slammed the door open. The house smelled like it was burning. Not really like a fire smell, but more like burning plastic and trash. I was panicked. I was the adult and had no idea what to do in that situation. We checked the house. I turned off the air conditioning, thinking it might be on fire. We opened all the windows and fell asleep on the couches downstairs. The next day, the smell was still lingering, but less overwhelming. The air conditioner was fine when I turned it back on. Like usual, the day was fine. That next night, my brother and I went on a jack-in-the-box run. It might have taken 30 minutes. We arrived home to a mess of blood, vomit, and shit. The dog was sick all over the living room. We immediately took him to an emergency vet, certain that he was dying. They checked him for everything that they could and gave him a clean bill. When we got home, all hell broke loose. My brother and I were cleaning up the mess with the doors open for airflow. There were absolutely insane banging noises coming from upstairs. We hadn't locked up on the way out. My brother thought that someone had snuck in and was trashing the place. He went up to check, and I hung out downstairs ready to call the cops if need be. Nothing happened. Nothing even seemed out of place. We kept cleaning, but the noise started almost immediately. It kind of sounded like someone was shouting behind a wall of cement. I couldn't tell the gender. My brother told me he had been fine until I got there, that I could leave if I wanted. I totally did, and I didn't go back. My parents sold the house this year. During the interim of the move, they stayed in an Airbnb. My brother lived really close to his work, so he stayed in the house with the dog for a few weeks. This story is just his own, so I'm not sure if I believe it. Like I said, he's kind of strange, but he's also not really one to embellish. He had been hearing the usual things, even his name being called in the night, but ignored all of it. His friends had been coming over to keep him company. The last day he was supposed to finish moving, he brought another friend. He says he felt that they were being watched the whole time when they cleared the place out, and his friend left him to lock up. They got into the car facing the house when they noticed that the blinds were open. They were definitely closed on the way out. His friend claims that he saw them open from the corner of his eye. My brother says that there is a woman squatting in front of a downstairs window, close to where he had just left from. She was pale, her nose was hooked, and her hair was black and stringy. Again, classic horror movie ghost. He said she had black eyes with visible white dots in the centers. Inside-out eyes, as he called them, and she was smiling. He says it took him a second of shock to realize that she was looking directly at him. He felt sick, like she could walk right out and get him. They burned rubber when his friend snapped out of it, and they screamed at each other all the way down the road about what they saw. He called me right after to explain it, but I was with my own friends and not really willing to listen at the time. What messes me up is that my mom thought he had a psychotic break. He went into his room and cried all night at the Airbnb. She thought something had happened with his girlfriend. My brother is not a crier. I haven't seen him do that since we were little. When we got together and talked about it, his eyes teared up then, too. He said he didn't know why, but he knew that she wanted to kill him. He drew a picture of her. It's not great, but it still fills me with the deepest foreboding. It took me a while to realize that I saw her too, just once in my bedroom almost 5 years ago. Suddenly it made sense. I knew it didn't feel like a woman, but it felt feminine, like something pretending to be a woman. My ex brought this up today. We dated all through high school and had a few experiences together that she recounts as her only paranormal encounters. I would love to still think that this was my own delusion, but it was shared by way too many people. Maybe a few things can be explained, but most of it truly can't. It has affected me so deeply that I'm still terrified that if I think too much about her, she'll follow us, a state away. So the area is deep in the Monongahela Forest in Virginia. I was doing some hiking there alone, trying to explore the new area, seeing what's out there. Everything was going pretty smooth in general, except for one occurrence that had gotten me blown away completely. By the way, I'm a 37-year-old male, been hiking in forests and mountains many times, never had an issue. Anyway, so I'm walking in the forest. It was around 4 p.m. I was alone. I had everything on me, including a radio beacon, compass, GPS on my phone, and smartwatch. So as you can see, taking my precautions in case I get lost, so that I can figure out my whereabouts and get back. I also even had printed maps on me. While walking, I all of a sudden felt some sort of weird, very weird quietness. As if you know it was the vacuum. No birds chirping, just quietness. And what's extra weird about it was that it was so quiet that I could hear the humming in my ears that you sometimes get to hear in total silence. I'm thinking, okay, quite odd. First, though, is that there might have been a predator in the vicinity, so I was trying to keep an eye out for that. I did carry something to protect myself with just in case I got attacked. Anyway, I just keep walking. No predator, but the quietness was just there. It's strange. I did not even see any birds anymore, just trees. I also noticed that the weather started getting worse, it became cloudy in an odd way. I don't know how to explain it. Long story short, the weather got bad pretty much out of nowhere. At this point, I kind of started feeling I don't know how to describe it, I guess uneasiness. I decided to go back, and here's this. All of a sudden, the GPS is out on both my phone and my smartwatch, and the compass is spinning as if there's a magnet close by or something like that. That got me very concerned because it pretty much means that I can't find out where to go in case I get lost. I started walking back. None of my navigational tools are working. I'm kind of still going back, just kind of orienting myself by the way that I came in. All of a sudden, I see the clouds above are really bizarre. It's like most of the clouds are weird and grayish in color, but they're not like clouds, but more kind of like fog, which is really way up. Then there was another cloud kind of surrounded by gray clouds, which was black. I've never seen a cloud look like that before. It was almost like the night sky. Then the craziness happened. All of a sudden, I hear music. Like a town clock bell or something like that, doing it every 10 seconds or so. I don't know, at the time I just got scared, really freaked out, and I just started running very, very fast back where I had come from. I was sprinting, and then eventually I noticed that the weather got better. It was no longer cloudy. The clouds weren't in fact visible anywhere near. I looked at my compass and GPS, and it was back up. I was, in fact, headed in the correct direction. After that, I just went back to the place where I had parked and left. Later that day, I looked up the weather forecast for that area. There wasn't supposed to be any cloudiness anywhere. It was supposed to be a sunny day with only sporadic clouds. I told my story to my buddies, also hikers. They say it might have been that I could have maybe fallen and maybe had a dream of that, but I don't think so because I don't remember falling or having a dream. Anyways, it's kind of a weird story. Maybe there's a logical explanation, but I don't know. This is a true story that happened to me. Back in 2008, my girlfriend and I decided to go to an abandoned mental asylum off of Highway 82 in Alabama called Old Bryce. It shut down a few years back due to malpractice, and some of the ghost legends, like the number 2 ghost, involve murder by staff at the facility. Essentially, this was a dumping ground for people that society didn't know what to do with. Thousands of people were sent there and died there. The facility consisted of 4 buildings: Bryce, the residence hall, S.D. Allen, the medical facility, the crematorium, and the guard shack. I have seen 2 ghosts in the residence hall, the bigger of the 2 that I can share with you now. My second visit to Old Bryce was strange. It was my first time inside the building, and I came prepared. It was me, my girlfriend, and our friend Chris. I had a flashlight and a DVD camcorder. Through the main entrance is a staircase on the right which zigzags up to the 2nd floor, complete with anti-suicide fence at the top. Make a left, another left, and then a quick right, and you are in the hall that led to the children's corridor. I had the flashlight in my left hand and my camera in my right, scanning, trying to catch something. On the left, at the entrance to that room, there was a bathroom with only a tub in it. I thought I saw something in the bathroom and shined the light that way, but nothing. I moved the camera and light, thought I saw it again and shined it back. Still nothing. Our night continued and finished without incident. The next day, I reviewed the footage. In that bathroom, I shined toward something I thought I saw, and I was right. When the light pans to the right, a bluish-white illuminated little girl's face peers out from behind the door to follow the beam. As the light shines back in her direction over the course of 2 frames, she is half behind the door, and then in the next frame, she is gone. My heart felt like an ice cube ran through it, because I was in such shock. I proceeded to show everyone that I knew. The girl's appearance was that of younger than 10, hair parted in the middle, unusually large forehead, and had some apparent deformation or disorder. I made the mistake of leaving the camera at a friend's house overnight, who is apparently not my friend, and he stole it. This is where it gets weirder. 2.5 years later, I was living in a different city. One of the legends of Old Bryce is that the windows grow back, and if you do any damage to them, that spirits will follow you home. I broke a window. I was laying in bed one night, around 3 or 4 a.m. I was on the verge of sleep, aware of where I was, and very comfortable. Out of nowhere, this immobilizing, tingling sensation started at the tips of my toes. I was laying on my stomach with my arms under the pillow, completely helpless as this sensation crept its way slowly up my legs, midsection, and eventually my entire body over the course of about 20 seconds. Once it covered me, I heard the whisper of a little girl directly in my ear say, "I'm in your room." I cringed, and for some reason I told her that I loved her. The feeling stopped and left me on the verge of tears. It may or may not have been that little girl from the asylum, but according to the legend, it makes sense. My brother and I were staying out at night at our grandparents' house, and now for context, her house is in the middle of the ghetto in Golf Manor. Anyway, me and my brother were watching TV and my grandma was at the store, and then suddenly my brother says, "Want to go into the basement?" Not trying to sound like a wuss, I agreed. This was the worst decision of the month. We go into the basement, and it is creepy as hell, and when we reach the bottom of the staircase, the door shuts behind us. Now, I just shake it off as natural, but still, I feel uneasy. We go into the garage because her garage is in the basement, so we start going through. We find a rusty pipe and a motorcycle handlebar and some faint writing on the wall. We obviously find other things like a lawnmower and lawn stuff too. But then, we heard a loud bang, like the sound of a metal door slamming. It was the laundry room door. We almost crapped our pants, and we ran back upstairs, scared as hell. Later that night, we started to fall asleep. Grandma was already asleep. We heard what sounded like all the basement doors opening and slamming shut. Grandma, like I said, was not awake. We ended up finally falling asleep and told her about what happened the next morning. She just laughed and said, "That's just Jim messing with you." And then she explained that Jim was the old house owner who had died there. That didn't really help us much, but it did ease our minds. I grew up not far from Manteno State Hospital. It's an abandoned insane asylum in the far south Chicago suburbs. My dad would sometimes drive my family down there, and we'd circle around the property by car just for fun. When I turned 16, he bought me my own little beater car, and of course, I had to show this awesome place to my friends. By the time I was old enough to go exploring, many of the original buildings had been renovated and repurposed as businesses. Half of the property was converted into a local VA hospital, and a quarter of it was torn down and replaced with new housing. Only a handful of the original buildings remained, all clustered in the back corner of the campus. One summer day, I took friends A, B, and C to go check it out. We brought our cameras and went with the intent to go inside and explore it. We parked in a lot where other people parked to go to work in one of the other buildings to avoid suspicion, and walked about a quarter mile to the abandoned hall. As we walked up to this creepy old building, I felt sick to my stomach and full of dread. The main doors were chained shut, and most of the windows were boarded up. I remembered walking on the porchway and choosing my steps carefully because the windows were busted out and there was glass everywhere. The four of us finally came upon a window that was accessible enough to climb into. Realizing that this was actually going to happen, I had a panic attack and couldn't go through with it. I was trembling and didn't want to be the scaredy cat, but I really couldn't do it. In fact, in just recounting that, I'm still scared. And this happened about 16 years ago already. Anyway, I handed my camera to friend A and told him to take the pictures. I was petrified and felt like I might puke at any given moment. Friend B and I walked back to the car in silence. I had a cigarette in the car while we waited for friends A and C to come back. My nerves calmed quickly enough. Friend B confessed that she was scared too, and was glad that I said something so that she didn't have to go in. Soon enough, our other two friends came running back at the car, full speed. We heard their footsteps pounding on the asphalt, and quickly unlocked the doors. I started the car up, and we were off in an instant. I assumed that the cops had arrived, so I sped off the campus and into town, hoping to blend into normal traffic. I asked them what had happened, and if the cops were called, and they said no. Both friends who had gone into the building said that they heard voices. Both of them said that they saw a hand curl around the frame of a big metal corridor door, and heard it slam shut with an impressive echo. Both of them testified that they heard someone crying, saying, "Where am I?" At some point, they got too frightened to continue and just decided to bolt. I was really spooked. Friend A, who had taken my camera, was eerily quiet. Friend C showed me that he had found a newspaper from 1979 on the floor, and he had taken it as a souvenir. I, being the more suspicious type, demanded that he get rid of it. I didn't want any potentially haunted objects in my car. So he tossed it out the window without too much coercing. It took us about 45 minutes to drive home, and since we were kinda shook, we decided to go to Denny's and rehash the experience. During the ride back, friend A fell asleep. This didn't concern me much at the time, but became an important factor to remember later on. We got to Denny's, and friends B and C went in ahead. I woke up friend A and asked him what happened. Why did they run? He said, "We saw someone sitting at the end of a hallway, cross-legged, on the floor. It was a man and he was crying, kind of rocking back and forth." He also explained that he believes it was the entity who used his energy to manifest, and that was why he was feeling so drained and passed out so hard on the way back. We had a late dinner and I drove everyone home afterwards. After I dropped off my last friend and was going back to my house, I distinctly felt someone pressing their knees into the back of the driver's seat. It's a familiar feeling, especially if you take the bus in high school. Lots of people prop their knees up on the seat and the feeling is unmistakable. I yelped and sat up straight so that my back wasn't touching my chair and drove home faster. The very next day, I picked up my cousin to go see a movie together. She blurted out to me that she thought she had seen someone in my back seat. I was immediately horrified, as I hadn't confided in her the events from the night before. I asked her which seat, and she said, of course, behind the driver's seat. That night I had a dream about a man. He was Caucasian, mid-30s, brown hair, and partially bald. He had brown eyes. He was wearing a white cotton vest, which I found odd. I instinctively knew it was the ghost that my friends had seen in the hospital. In the dream, he was guiding me through a series of booby traps. He was holding me by the elbow and walking with me. He seemed sweet and harmless. I thought maybe he's a guardian or something. These dreams continued for about a week straight. Friends who didn't know about our trip to the asylum started to have experiences in my car. One friend heard and felt someone whisper in her ear. Another had her elbow grabbed by someone in the back seat. I felt the knees in my back on many occasions. In fact, I started to anticipate it and often drove without my back touching the seat at all. One time I felt like someone was shaking my seat while I was driving. Like hands on either side of the chair and just violently shaking it. When the experiences and the dreams didn't stop, I grew afraid. I didn't feel like he was a guardian anymore. Finally, after about a week and a half of this, I sat down with friend A again. I asked him, "Do you remember what he looked like?" He said, "All I could see was that he was balding and he was wearing a white vest. I don't know how, but I think his name was David." I told my parents about what happened after that. They suggested that I tell David that he wasn't allowed to follow me anymore. To tell him to go to the light or whatever. At this point I was ready to do anything because I was on edge and spooked all the time. I prayed every time I came into the house that he wouldn't follow me in. I was afraid to go out with my friends. I was afraid to go to sleep sometimes. So, 2 weeks after our initial venture into the asylum, I went back with friend A. We went during the daytime and idled in front of the building. I said aloud, "You don't belong here with me. You need to go home," or something along those lines. I prayed a lot. I didn't want him anymore. I felt bad, but I needed him to stay there. We parked and just kind of sat there quietly for a while. I think friend A and I were just saying goodbye, severing ties, I don't know, but it felt sad. While we were parked, I did hear doors slamming inside the building. At one point, I heard someone laughing as well. I envisioned him leaving me in my car. I told him that he could never follow me again, that he needed to go, and to move on. We left the hospital that day and didn't go back for many years. I never dreamt of him again. I've never told anyone the full story for 2 reasons. 1 being that it sounds totally ridiculous, and 2, because I'm afraid, and that thinking about him too much will send some sort of psychic beacon out to attract him or other spirits back to me, when that's totally the opposite of what I want. The story I'm about to tell happened when I was little, so basically it's my mother's and my uncle's version of it. When I was 4 years old, I was really sick. I basically couldn't digest the food that I ate, so my body had no defenses. I even spent weeks in intensive care at the hospital. The thing is, nobody knew what was wrong with me. For a year, 3 different doctors were trying to figure out what was happening. They made me do a lot of tests, even for rare conditions, but they were always negative. My mom was completely desperate. In her own words, "You were gonna die before I could even figure out what was taking you away." One day, my mom was with me at my uncle's house. He's my dad's brother, and he lives with his wife and the mom of his wife, who was like a grandmother to me. So this old woman told my mom that she was beginning to think that I was possessed by a spirit. I live in a place with a lot of esoteric beliefs and traditions, especially followed by the old people. She asked my mother if she remembered going to the cemetery while she was pregnant with me. At that moment, my mother remembered that she had gone to bring flowers to her father's grave on the day of All Saints. There's a legend here that if you go to the cemetery while you're pregnant, or with a newborn baby, the spirits will try to possess it so that they can get to live again. My mom and uncle threw me into the car to take me to a church known for such cases. They said that I was screaming and crying the whole way in the back of the car. "Let me get out! I don't want to go there!" I didn't even know where we were going, or why, since they didn't tell me anything. My uncle was driving, and suddenly, we hit a traffic jam. He tried to slow down the car, and then he realized that the brakes weren't responding. He kept stepping on the brakes without the car responding until we were about to hit the car that was standing right in front of us. All of this happened in a matter of seconds. Then the car stopped completely, just inches away from colliding. When we were sitting still, the strangest thing of the trip happened. They both felt as if several people from the outside of the car were pushing the car, shaking it to one side and the other. I was still screaming. Long story short, we arrived to the church. I didn't want to come in, but I finally did. I was crying all the time. When we got out, I was in a much better mood. My mom bought me donuts on our way to the car. I ate one and then puked, but it was as if I had puked up something with sandy texture. Something completely dry. My uncle stopped the car and got me out in case I was going to keep getting sick. Suddenly, I did a strange sound. It was like a burp, but way too loud and deep sounding for a small 4-year-old kid. This happened a couple of days ago. My family and I went to an old asylum while on vacation. They had renovated it and put a couple of stores and a restaurant inside, so my father thought it would be a nice place to visit. When we first drove into the driveway, I was overcome with dizziness, and I couldn't even finish the message that I had been typing while we were pulling in. As I got out of the car, the dizziness subsided for the most part, and we all went inside. It still looked like an asylum. The doors were big metal cage doors. The floor was old and cracked. The walls were old, yellowed bricks, and there were entrances that covered over, with more bricks so that no one could enter. As we began walking down the halls, I noticed that something was off. The overall feeling in the place was just terrible. I started getting a headache, but it was only minor. I know spirits can give people headaches and stomach aches, so I wasn't at all surprised. As I said, mine was minor, but I couldn't help but notice that my sister was getting worse and worse. There was an old metal-looking door that resembled something that would be on an animal cage. It was just a pitch-black, empty room on the other side. I had mentioned to my mother the feeling that I had about the place, and so as a joke, she held me close to the cage and said, "Look in there. Do you see a ghost yet?" As they were all laughing, I stood there in shock, because there was someone on the other side of the gate looking back at me. I ripped away from her grasp, and kept walking down the hall away from the cage-like door. My sister was giving me a look, so I knew that she wanted to tell me something. We went off to the side, and she told me that she had a terrible, pounding headache. We kept walking as she told me about it, but I could see that she was getting worse, like she didn't know where she was going anymore, so I took her outside the building for a minute to help her head, and told her to pray and imagine that there was a white light surrounding her. She did this and started to walk away from the building as her headache was getting better. My father had scheduled for us to eat inside the building, and our table was ready, so we were forced to go back in. She told me that her headache was even worse than before, and that she was about to pass out, and that the praying in white light now made it worse instead of better. We were texting each other, and she was telling me that she felt a strong pressure on her back and head. Soon enough, I could see that she couldn't take it anymore, so I took her outside again. My parents were furious, but only because they didn't understand. Once I took her outside, she started crying and shaking, and so I took her away from the building, and we went for a walk. We went across the street, and I talked to her until her headache stopped, and so did the pressure. Our parents texted us telling us that the food was there, so once again we were forced to enter the building. I held her hands and prayed with her before we entered again. We ate as fast as possible, and got out of there even before our parents did. We drove off, but she still felt uneasy. And so did I. We got out of the car at our next destination, but it was almost as if we were still in the asylum. My sister started crying and shaking again, and she asked me if it could make it kill herself. I asked her why, and she told me that it was giving her suicidal thoughts and that it was making her depressed and draining her energy. I took her and my mom and dad, and we all prayed together over her. As I placed my hand on her head while praying, it was weird. I could feel it there still. It had followed us. It thought that she would be an easy target, and maybe she would have been, if I wasn't there. Maybe that's what scares me the most. I'm not sure if it's gone, but when we arrived back at the hotel, I saw and heard someone following me in the hall, so I thought it was my sister. But when I turned around, no one was there. But that could have just been a different spirit. I'm pretty used to them by now. Last night, my sister and I didn't sleep. We were kept awake the whole night through. Maybe we were scared, or maybe we were kept up by something else. Something dark. Something inhuman. I travel to many different cemeteries for work in Massachusetts. I'm a grave salesperson and go to these cemeteries on an as-needed basis. One day I was finishing up a sale and decided to use the bathroom in the tiny office shed in the back of the cemetery. The door to enter the office was locked, but the bathroom door was broken and wouldn't close all the way. I didn't care that the bathroom door wouldn't really close because no one was coming into the office anyway. It was late, and all the groundsmen had went home for the day. Just as I was finishing my business, the bathroom door slams shut, and since the knob was broken, the door just bounced and swung open. My first reaction was that someone had entered the office and the air pressure had sucked the door open. I run out and see that no one had come in. There were no open windows to cause a breeze. This door just slammed and opened all on its own. I was shaken up, but I still had some paperwork to complete. I acknowledged that there may be a presence in the room with me, but I didn't want to appear frightened of it. So I sat down in there for a few minutes and took my time finishing my work. Nothing has happened there since then, but I always acknowledge the entity as if it's watching over the place. When I was young, I lived in a small, one-story house in a bad community a little ways south of Atlanta, Georgia. My parents bought the house when there were no other houses in the neighborhood, save for one or two neighbors that weren't exactly close enough to really be counted as proper neighbors. Well, by the time that I had come along and gotten old enough to play outside on my own, there were way more houses. It wasn't a huge neighborhood or anything, but it was way more built up than when my parents originally moved there. Behind my house, there were some woods. The woods were pretty dense, and went on for a few miles before there was a middle school and its football field. Sometimes at night, if it was clear, you could see the stadium lights glow way beyond the tree line. Anyways, in these woods I discovered a creek. My parents told me that when they first moved here, there were all sorts of fish and crawdads living in there. But when I first discovered the creek, I found nothing except for maybe a few tiny minnows. Maybe 5 or so spanning a mile, both up the creek from my house and down the creek. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't live in a very good area. The news was always talking about some shooting or drive-by, but where my neighborhood sat, it was usually more tame. This was in the early 2000s, and I didn't have internet or any sort of gaming console, but it was fine because I loved being outside anyways. Even if the mosquitoes were literally the worst, and I have a more severe allergic reaction to their bites. My favorite place to go and hide was out by the creek. But one time I went down, I remember seeing more vultures and scavenging birds flying around and sitting in the trees than normal. But no big deal. It was probably just a dead deer or something. I made my way to the creek and rolled up my jeans to stomp around in the water and kick up mud or whatever I used to do. But before I even finished rolling up my pants legs, I saw something. Still bent over, I was pretty close to a sickly pale, decently fresh-looking, human finger. It startled me for more than one reason, and I shot up like a rocket. There was nothing else around, though. No signs of other people, no blood, no body. Just a finger in the creek behind my house. It bothered me, but I was one of those weird, quiet kids, so it was a few months before I said anything. As it turns out, a few doors down there was a man hiding from the FBI in his sister's house. I never found out if he was an actual killer or anything, but I do remember waking up one night to see SWAT trucks and officers outside. One of the officers knocked on our door to ask my parents a few questions and to check to see if things were all right, and I remembered the finger. Of course, it was months later, so I doubted that it was still there and said nothing. I never heard anything else related to the guy, or the FBI, or the finger. But in my 8, maybe 9-year-old mind, it all seemed connected. And to this day, I'm pretty sure there was a murderer a few doors down from me when I was a kid. A good buddy of mine, Andy, and I went for a hike around our local quarry. We took a trail that we hadn't taken before. It had really awesome lookouts and a crazy graveyard that we walked by. It was super cool. We also hiked around to this other awesome spot with big rocks to climb. Then we decided to head back to the car. As we were walking back, Andy said that he felt like he had just walked through a giant spider web on the trail, but couldn't see or feel any strands to pull off. I said, "You just went through a portal," jokingly. He said, also half-jokingly, that he felt like he might have. Then he said that he started feeling a weird static electricity. This was strange because I was feeling the exact same thing. We were walking, and seriously, it felt strangely just intense, with jolts of energy going through both of our bodies. Our plan was to take a break at this cool wooden deck down by the quarry water. It was about halfway back to the end of the trail. The plan was originally to chill there for a minute and listen to music on the water, but after that happened we were freaking out and wanting to see if we could feel that same electricity again. So we went back the way we came, and actually took another way back to the trail. We didn't feel anything this time. We had walked just far enough to kind of dismiss what had happened, but then we got back to the same spot where it had happened before. As soon as we started walking up the trail, all of a sudden it was like everything got so quiet, and it felt like we had walked into a cloud of energy that was even stronger than before. There was even an audible buzzing sound in our ears. It seriously made both of us stop in our tracks and say, "It's happening again." But this time, it was not a very good feeling. Like, I've never had a feeling of, "do not go that way," that intense before. We turned right around and walked the heck out of there, spooked as hell. My wife and I were camping last night in Blue River Reservoir in Oregon. We camp here often and decided to explore up FSR 520 and found a cool abandoned bridge far back in the woods over Cook Creek. The spot was beautiful and we were set up over the river on this long abandoned bridge. If you've ever been in the Oregon woods, you know that they can give off a creepy vibe, and this was no exception, but it really was a dream campsite. Being 40 feet directly over a river while on a bridge with limbs growing everywhere over it isn't your everyday spot. I'll throw in for background that there was no one within at least 3 miles of us, and we had to hike our way in, approximately 1/10 of a mile from where we had parked. We explored around the area for a bit, and didn't come across anything out of the ordinary besides a pair of shoes and a name, Mona, written in ash on a rock of the fire ring. While we were sitting by the fire, I noticed a very bright flash of light over the river and snapped my head up, but didn't see anything. A few moments later, I was paying closer attention and watched a ball of light float, even with the bridge 40 feet in the air, from one side to the other in the woods over 50 feet. The light was very blue. My thought at first had been somehow that headlights had come through, but I would have heard a car and no man-made light could get to us in this isolated area. This blue light was unlike anything I had ever seen. I mentioned it to my wife, but didn't want to freak her out, so I dropped the subject soon after. Later that night in the tent, we had the mesh lining up where we could see outside. My wife gasped and watched as the same blue light floated at the end of the bridge 30 feet away and hovered in the air. After a good bit of time, it shot off into the woods. It being late at night, we were obviously scared of someone's headlamp, but it shot away 40 times as quickly as any human could go, and we saw nothing attached. Our dog left the tent and stared at that exact spot for the next 10+ minutes, while also peeking down the side of the bridge very seriously. Last year, I went to the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in Weston, West Virginia. It was a birthday trip for my friend, and since we both had an interest in the paranormal, we decided to head there and check it out. If you're a paranormal enthusiast, you should know that this place is supposedly haunted. Looking into the brief history of the place, deaths, suicides, housing for Civil War patients, housing for tuberculosis patients, and medical patients, you would definitely expect some ghosts are not at rest. It was cold and dark as it was November at around 5 p.m. or so. We made it for the last historic tour of the West Wing and the Civil War Wing. As we waited for the tour guide to gather our group, we took a tour of the front entrance and saw all these patients' drawings. One was of a man cutting his father's head off, and there was a long list of reasons for being admitted into the asylum. We then went back to wait in the lobby for our tour to begin. As we sat there waiting, I felt a slight tug at my jacket on my right side. My friend was standing on my left side. I brushed it off, as maybe being my sleeve button caught my jacket, just some casual debunking, since what are the odds of 12 people standing in a lobby that the ghost somehow decided to screw with me? Our tour began, and if you studied the place you would know that the building is shaped into L-like sections as to try and let in as much sunlight to the building as possible. It was one of their treatment ideas. Eventually, we made it to a section where they hosted the Halloween parties, which was originally, if I remember, a place where patients could acquire their medication or new clothes. After the tour guide walked away, I waited for my turn to walk through the doorway. At this moment, a loud bang came from the closet. I again shrugged it off and debunked it as maybe an animal or a bird who had gotten into the closet and knocked something over in there. Our tour finally came to a close, and we began to walk back to the lobby. I was in the back of the group with my friend in front of me. No one was behind me. As we were beginning to walk through the connection between the first and second part of the building, I looked back at the end of the hall. Down at the end, by the nurse's station, I saw a large, black figure cross in front of the window. I was immediately spooked. I started taking steps back and forth to see if maybe it was my shadow or anything really like that, but it was nothing. I could not debunk it. So I just continued on and tried to write it out of my mind. Then came the final walk to the lobby. This building is massive, by the way. If I remember correctly about this, they said the building is almost a quarter-mile long from end to end, so you can only imagine how long these wing halls are. Before I made it to the lobby, a chill went up my neck. I'm again in the back of the group. I would also like to mention that I have long hair as well. After that chill, I immediately felt as if someone blew on my hair, and the sound of a quick breath. There was no wind in that building, no doors being opened or closed, nothing. Someone or something blew my hair. I continued to keep my cool and started talking to my friend about it, who had no experiences whatsoever and thought that I was just trying to spook her. I was a bit unnerved, but we didn't want to leave without a t-shirt, so we went into the gift shop and talked to the lady inside about if she had experienced paranormal activity. She said most of it happens on the 3rd floor, and has had many people talk about seeing, hearing, and feeling things. A few years ago, I was on holiday in the south of France with my boyfriend, now fiancé, and his family. We stayed in a small village about half an hour inland. One afternoon, me and my boyfriend went for a walk around the village and came across a church cemetery, so we went in to have a look. It wasn't creepy or anything, as it was just daytime, and it was right in the middle of the village, and there were a few cars going past and several people walking around. The cemetery was interesting to us because it was different to a British one, as there were little tombs the size of a garden shed around the edge that were very old and had whole families buried inside. After walking around for a while, we walked up to one of the tombs that had no glass on the door and looked inside. You couldn't see anything odd in there. There was a cross on the wall and a vase that would have had flowers in it. But the smell and the atmosphere changed right outside that tomb. It made us both feel ill, like a sudden sense of dread overtook everything. The air seemed stale. We left quite swiftly, and I felt as if we were being followed after that, until we left the cemetery and got back onto the pavement. My grandpa was always a big hunter. It's not uncommon here in the Midwest. He would always find new areas to hunt and get permission to hunt on private properties. So one day, him and his buddy got permission to go on this private land that I believe was around 100 acres total. I don't recall the specifics of exactly where the forest was. For now, I know for a fact that this was in the Michigan-Indiana border area, or in other words, Michiana. Anyways, they set out around noon to get to the forest and arrived at around 1 p.m. and started hiking back into the woods. They each had their own tree stands or blinds set up prior, so they made their way to them. I remember my grandpa telling me that they hiked a few miles back, so they had to have been deep in the woods. As the day goes on, they don't see any deer, so once the sun began to set, they decided to start making their way back to the truck and met up near my grandpa's tree stand. This is where the weird stuff happens. They're making their way back and the sun has completely set. Luckily, they brought flashlights for the walk back because otherwise they would have had to have walked a few miles in pitch black. Anyways, they finally have about a mile of hiking left when they see something or someone crouched in front of them with their back turned to them. My grandpa described him as a bald white guy wearing a black and white striped shirt. My grandpa's friend speaks up after a moment that I can only imagine as a "what the heck is this feeling?" and asks what he's doing out there, and without a word, the man stands up and faces them, stares, then levitates up toward the trees, and disappears. After that, they sprinted to the truck and never went back to that land again. I know it's not the craziest of stories, and sounds so weird, but I know for a fact that my grandpa did experience this. My grandpa's not a liar, and it was never some scary campfire story that he told us grandkids. When he told me, I could see in his face that it was disturbing him, and is something that he can never forget. I'm not saying we have a ghost, spook, or spirit, but something phenomenological is definitely happening in our home. The brief background on the home is that it's over 70 years old in an older part of our town. The previous resident was a well-respected attorney in the area, and he died here. We wouldn't learn this until after we moved in. The house was almost completely dismantled and rebuilt with new everything. Paint, electric, plumbing, drywall, etc. One floor, not a whole lot of square footage. An attic that has about 2.5 feet of clearance. Not long after getting moved in, my wife and I learned a little bit more about the house's history, and that the previous owner had passed away, and that it was quite some time after his death before he was discovered. We made peace with this information and continued settling in. The first peculiar incident wasn't really that peculiar. It had been well over a year since the previous owner passed, but he kept receiving mail. A lot of mail. Fun mail, too. Magazines and newspapers with the subscriptions renewing. We remarked on the mail as being merely interesting, and for the sake of creating a tradition, we always kept the old attorney's mail for a day or two, in case he just wanted to read it. Eventually, this would trickle to a stop. The second peculiar incident caught our attention. After 2 months of being in the house, we decided to get newer, better locks for the doors. I had a new key, my wife had a new key. 2 extra keys went on the key hook. A few days go by, and my wife asked me if I had lost my key or if I had trouble locking or unlocking the door. I hadn't. She showed me the 2 extra keys. Both were still on the wire ring, and both had bends of about 15 degrees right at the key shoulder. We agreed that this was odd, but we let it go with some loose rationalizations. The third peculiar incident started a little over 2 years ago, and continues still. Neither I nor my wife smoke. However, about once every 2 weeks on a random day, and usually after midnight, the distinct odor of warm cigarette smoke can be smelled in our living room. At first, we thought it was someone walking nearby, or a neighbor, or an odd or unfortunate combination of smells from a garbage can. We got some cameras, and pointed them outside to see what we could see. Nothing. The last time we smelled cigarettes was about 2 weeks ago. And we've had electricians check our wiring on unrelated matters just in case. The fourth incident relates to the second. 2 metal spoons in the silverware drawer were bent. Almost snapped. Aside from the cigarette smoke, it's been a while since anything has happened, until last week. For whatever reason, the attorney's mail is resumed and the 5th peculiar incident has occurred. I work out in the woods, and my wife now works from home in the company of our 2 cats. In a flurry of texts and phone calls, she told me that it sounded like someone was running around upstairs, as if they were rushing across the house to answer the phone, was how she described it. We've had squirrels in our useless attic and the occasional tree branch. The footsteps exceeded both of those. The 6th and most recent peculiar incident is equal parts mundane and intriguing. We have a favorite spatula. Yes, we do. Some of you reading this probably have your own favorite spatula, spoon, fork, pot, pan as well. We used the bright robin's egg blue utensil to make our Thanksgiving dinner and set it aside with the rest of the cooking detritus. That evening, and the following morning, the kitchen is cleaned and everything is put away. Sunday began the greater holiday baking season, requiring the favorite spatula. Except, it was missing. The ceramic container where the utensils are stored has everything else. Red things, green things, metal things, wooden things. Visual inspection of the surrounding area results in zilch. Every cupboard and drawer opened and investigated to nothing. We sadly conclude that after the big cleanup, it must have ended up in the trash. So we began an online hunt for its replacement. On Friday last, I get a picture of the utensils sitting quite happily amongst all the others. I was confused by this, since the evening before we had to use other tools instead of the missing spatula because it was missing. So, sometime after 9:30 p.m. Thursday and 7:18 a.m. on Friday, something that was missing for at least 5 days returned. So, here it is in order. 1. A confluence of strange coincidences. 2. Sleepwalking. 3. Someone is managing to live in our attic. 4. That I and my wife are in a weirdly mutual prank cycle. Or 5. Something real is happening. If you have any ideas, tests, solutions, resources, or suggestions, I'm listening. Nothing seems malvoyant about what's been happening, but it's definitely happening. Just for backstory, I'm an 18-year-old college student, but I live at home with my mom and my younger sisters, who live at my dad's half of the time, because my university is in my city. We also have our dog Kiefer and our cat Boots. My cat, Princess, died of a severe fungal infection about a month ago, and I feel like some of this might be tied to her passing. A little over 2 weeks ago, I hung out with my friend Z for the first time since the COVID situation, due to the fact that we went to the same university and once it had shut down, he moved about an hour or so south of my city to live with his girlfriend since he couldn't live in the dorms. Z and his girlfriend picked me up and took me to their apartment, talking about how they've been to an abandoned asylum a few times over the past couple months. They lived with his girlfriend's older brother, who has issues of his own, both drug-related and just general anger issues. A notable moment that they mentioned to me as they were taking me to their apartment was that one of the times the three of them went there together, her brother acted very strangely. He sat in one of the chairs that was left behind, his eyes rolled back into his head, and he was knocking glass out with his elbows and getting deep cuts, but didn't seem fazed. His anger also apparently peaked, and he was threatening to cut Z and his girlfriend if they didn't leave. As they left, they saw shadows moving everywhere, and her brother was talking to himself. Over the passing days, her brother would talk about demons and would yell about wanting to go back there. He broke into the room Z and his girlfriend slept in when it was locked. He was dragging a knife along the walls, growling, and would scream about these demons. When Z was telling me this, I could tell he was being serious. He looked scared to even tell the story. When they went back, her brother was screaming and sat back in the chair and muttered to himself, and after that everything went back to normal. He stopped talking about the demons, they stopped seeing shadow people, and the bizarre behavior ceased. This could have been tied to the drugs that he was on, but they felt the need to say this because they were also seeing shadows, and they were not high. When we got to their apartment, there were other friends of theirs, as well as her brother, inside. I didn't recognize any of them, so I sat and made small talk with all of them, and the atmosphere was generally calm aside from the blasting rock music and a couple of guys playing GTA V on high volume. A little while after I get there and we're all talking, one of the boys asked when we were going to the asylum. Her brother, who I guess we'll call M from now on, said that we were leaving around 11 p.m. since it was an hour-long drive to get there. We had a few hours of time to kill, so someone came and brought us McDonald's, and we talked and stuff until we had to leave in 2 cars due to us having a group of 9 people total. Z drove the car that I was in, and his girlfriend C drove in the car ahead of us. The atmosphere got tense quickly, because only about 10 minutes into our drive on the highway, C almost got into an accident. We watched her speed up to pass a semi, and she had hit a bunch of cones, and we couldn't find her car, which had a total of 5 people in it, for about 20 minutes, which was strange, because there were hardly any cars on the road at this time of night, and the car was easy to identify from the back lights alone. Eventually, we park across the street from this large field where the asylum would be. C told us that the near miss was because of the semi. It was either speeding up or slowing down really quick, so she sped up. She was in an anxious mood after that. We walked through this large field for 10 minutes, with Z explaining that there are multiple buildings, but one of them got demolished and a couple of others had asbestos, so there were only a couple that were safe to go in. He told us it was closed down in 2003 because the patients were being mistreated or something like that. I don't remember everything that happened because my adrenaline was insane that night. We get to a building that almost looks like the outside was for transport vehicles. C refused to go in because she was anxious, so she stayed outside with Z. It ended up being me and a group of people that I didn't really know just exploring this building. The graffiti eased my anxiety a bit, but it was still eerie as we went through. Water was everywhere from leaks. There was broken glass all over the place. Computers were broken. We found clothes in old lockers, and we even found a pile of what looked like animal bones. I was partially scared because of the atmosphere, but also because I've heard of the things that M did there. After about 30 minutes or so, we left, and C and Z were not there. We had called their phones, screamed their names, looked all around this huge field, and we couldn't find them. About 15 minutes into our search, we heard the most terrifying shriek. I can't even properly describe it because it was something that I have never heard before in my life. It sounded like whoever screamed must have been in pain. It was loud and it echoed, and we all just ran, trying to figure out who it came from. We were scared that it had come from C. At this point, it's past 1 a.m. We're terrified. They're still not answering their phones, and we were terrified that we were about to have to call 911. Then we heard someone from our group say that they had found them. We ran, and they looked confused. We were all trying to explain that we were yelling for them and calling them, but they didn't hear us, and their phones didn't ring. We also told them about the scream, but they didn't hear that either. They told us that they were just in another building, and were looking for us, too. I spent the car ride on the way back to the apartment trying to explain the scream to him, because he was acting like he thought we were just joking. I think he believes now, though, because now it was just us talking about it, not a bunch of people at once. The next day I'm back at my own home, and things are pretty well back to normal. The only bruise that I had was from Z's teething puppy. Over the next few days, more and more bruises were appearing everywhere on my body, the oddest one being in the shape of a V on my forearm. I have never had that happen before, especially because it was so large that it nearly wrapped around my arm, and it was a perfect V. The other bruises were just all over my legs and arms, and are still appearing to this day. Last week, as I was settling in to go to bed, I was cuddling Boots and watching TV when I heard what sounded like a cat screaming from upstairs. I was on the couch downstairs. It was around 1 a.m., and it scared me even more because Boots was next to me and also turned his head in the direction of the sound. Our dog is a Husky and German Shepherd mix, and couldn't make that noise either. The next day, I talked to my mom about it, and she told me that she hadn't heard a thing. A couple days later, my mom and I were in the living room with the cat and dog when we heard the stairs creak. They creak whenever someone is on them, but you can tell who is on them by how loud they are, if that makes sense. We looked in that direction because it sounded like a cat was coming down the stairs, but nothing was there. Boots was right next to me, and Kiefer was on the couch. My sisters weren't home either. My mom told me that I should take comfort in the fact that it's probably Princess trying to let us know she's here with us. But ever since I went to the asylum, I've been really freaked out. About 8 years ago, my mom, sister, niece, and I decided to go for a look around a well-known and at the time abandoned mental asylum, the name of which is Royal Derwent Hospital, aka Willow Court, in New Norfolk, Tasmania. We started around some of the bigger main area buildings, which were fine, nothing too creepy, just a lot of mess and graffiti. I was taking some photos in one of the main halls there, and I moved backward to get a better shot. As I did, I felt a hand touch my back, and in that split second, thought that I had just stepped into one of my family members, and that they were shielding themselves from being stepped on. But as I turned around to apologize, there was no one there. In fact, I was the only one standing in my hall, as my family had moved on to another room. This creeped me out a bit, but I tried to play it off as my mind playing tricks, even though I could still feel where I had been touched. We moved through the rest of the asylum without further incident, until we made it down to where the cells were. These were a number of smaller buildings away from the main area. Most were a little bit creepy, but it was nothing too bad. Then we came to one building that was known for keeping violent patients. Within 30 seconds of being in this building, I had the most awful feeling wash over me. It was so sudden that I nearly bolted for the door. My mom got the same feeling, and we decided not to venture any further into that building and headed out. As we stepped outside, we stood for a second to gather ourselves. Then one of the heavy cell doors inside slammed shut. It was almost like an emphasis on the get out feeling that we had when we were inside. Needless to say, that pretty much did it for me, and we called it quits on our little adventure. My friend Ava hasn't lived with her mom in over 2 years since she moved in with her boyfriend. But recently I went back to her mom's house with her to grab some plants that she had propagated and have lunch. It was a normal day and I had been in the house many times before, so it wasn't any different. The visit was short, but when they went upstairs to discuss what they should do with her old room, I was left to my own devices on the first floor. The basement didn't have a door to the downstairs and the dining room was adjacent to it. So naturally, I decided to look down the stairs since it always gave me a spook. I'm not really a huge fan of the paranormal, and I never really had a cut and dry experience. I also never quote-unquote pick up on vibes either, but I hated the vibe of her mom's place, especially the basement. When I went to the stairs, I looked down them and saw a weird, humanoid figure in the darkness staring back at me. My entire body felt fuzzy, and I couldn't move until I heard Ava and her mom coming back down the stairs, and I hightailed it away from there. Not really sure what it was, but Ava has always said that the house was haunted, and that she avoids the basement like the plague. This happened in January of 2016 when I was in my late teens. The story keeps coming up amongst my friend group, and something about it kind of bugs me. I have no clue what I really saw. I just know that it seemed paranormal, and not anything that could be explained. I live about 2 hours away from an abandoned campus that was used as both a tuberculosis hospital and an asylum until the 1990s. I didn't really research it, nor did I believe in the paranormal at the time. I just thought that it would be so cool to go to an abandoned place. So I brought my 2 guy friends with me, one my age who was into the paranormal and had been there before, and one who was older than us, and my one friend that was a girl. I'm also a girl. It's one of those places that you'd get in trouble for trespassing at, so we hid my car and snuck in through a broken fence. I should mention that we went at around 8 or 9 p.m., so it was really dark out already. We go into the main building and are fine. We're not feeling anything weird, nothing like that. We exit that building and go into another that's maybe 2 buildings away, but within a couple of minutes we end up at the exact place where we exited the first building, the main entrance, and that felt a little off. We decided to venture into the basement. My girlfriend and I felt uneasy immediately, and suggested that we go back upstairs instead, which we did. We go up into the place where they kept children. This was evident because of all the children's toys on the ground, and there was a soundproof room. Some of the toys were moving, and there was a ball that was bouncing on its own. Our friend who's been there before stopped us while we were walking through a hallway. We heard a door slam, followed by footsteps in front of us. The hallway in front of us was also pitch black, while the rear of the hall was at least lit up a little bit by the moon. We turned around and went back. Against our better judgment, we let the boys bring us into the basement. As soon as my girlfriend stepped her foot onto the basement floor, her flashlight went out, and we couldn't get it back on for the life of us. It did end up coming back on later, but that didn't happen until we had already left the premises. Anyway, my phone that was at 80% immediately died. We were standing in the center of the room together, and around us, it was almost like a haze was there. I felt so sick and lightheaded. I had a dread in the pit of my stomach, and so did my friends. We felt like we were surrounded by other people. We quickly went back upstairs. This is when it gets extremely unsettling. We go into the ballroom and grab a table. We sit on it, each of us on an end. It was square. We heard a door slam shut, so I look up at the ceiling to avoid looking around the room. My friend who's into the paranormal starts trying to communicate with whatever was in there with us. He said, "Knock once if you're a boy and twice if you're a girl," and we heard one knock. As this was happening, I see a black figure that's almost human-looking sitting in the windowsill. It's kind of hunched over and very tall. Its leg is swinging, and then it takes off. It's crawling across the ceiling. I tug on my other guy friend's arm, and he shakes his head as to not acknowledge it, and I try to forget it. My girlfriend says out loud, "Do you guys see?" But my guy friend, who is ignoring it, cut her off and said, "Stop." My guy friend, who is trying to communicate with this thing, told it to come and sit down. We felt the air get freezing, and that's when he said, "We have to go. Goodbye. You're not allowed to follow us out." We all jumped up off the table and walked out. After we were out, we practically ran to the car and left as quickly as we could. As soon as I was in the car, I felt so much better physically. We were silent for a while, but then my friend who is ignoring the figure said, "Did you guys see that?" And of course we all said yes, and shared our experiences. He thanked my girlfriend and I for getting the message about ignoring it as much as possible. It still scares me to think about it to this day, and I always get chills when writing or talking about it. The amount of energy needed to manifest that is what boggles my mind the most. I'm not even completely sure what we saw, and as much as we discuss it, we cannot come to a solid conclusion. I took my young kids to visit my grandparents' gravesite for the first time. They were really freaked out to learn that dead people were buried underneath all the headstones. The headstone kitty-cornered to my grandparents was for a small boy around 4 or 5. When I noticed the age, I heard a whisper in my ear to talk about the kid. As I said, my kiddos were already really freaked out. I didn't want to add to the experience of learning about dead kids. I heard the whisper 2 or 3 times before we left. When we got into the car, my son said, "Who was that boy standing next to Grandpa? He looked really sick." I instantly had chills and got super emotional knowing that my grandpa was there with him. This happened a few years back, on my spring break, senior year of high school. I was hiking part of the Long Trail, which goes south from Glastonbury to Bennington, and it was the usual very cold nights, warm, muddy days Vermont usually has in spring, so pretty fun to hike in. I was going to take a day and rest my feet, go swimming in a pond and cool off, so I took a detour onto the Bald Mountain Trail. I got to my campsite around 5, and the sun was setting, so I set up my hammock and rain tarp and made a fire. I made some mountain house beef stroganoff and decided to just lay down and watch the flames. I hadn't seen anyone since before noon, which is unusual because it's a pretty well-traveled section of the trail. I started to get really uneasy, and it definitely felt like someone was watching me from a distance. I ended up sitting with my back against a maple, facing the fire and holding my camp knife. A few hours later, 9-ish, I heard a really loud crash in the woods, like a plane falling out of the sky or a freight train right next to me. Then dead silence. No wind, no leaves, no owls, just absolute quiet. I remember getting really uncomfortable and shouting out to see if there was anyone out there, but I just started hearing a really subtle, droning noise, like a key being rubbed on a brass string or radio static, but super low-pitched. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just watched the moon go really slowly over the sky and the sound get quieter as it got lighter outside. When I could see well enough to walk, I picked up my gear and sprinted back to the main trail and found some people up early and hiked with them all the way back. I was in a nearby abandoned Navy hospital with several friends. We had been in many times before and never had anything odd happen. We were on the top, the 3rd floor, and there were many broken windows, allowing the rain and nature in. There was a lot of mold and even moss growing in the old ceiling tiles that covered the floor at this point. One of our group, prone to asthma and respiratory issues, didn't take it too well. We all decided it was best to leave and began our descent into the basement, which was the route to the exit. This is when things got weird. I broke ahead of the group, something generally against our rules of exploring, but in my mind I had to get out. I was far enough ahead, around corners and such, that I couldn't even see their flashlights behind me anymore. My heart was racing, and I still don't know why. I finally got to the last door that led to the room that we would exit from. It was a heavier door that closed by itself. I reached for the doorknob, but something stopped me. I couldn't do it. Something in my mind wasn't letting me put my hand on the knob. All I felt was terror. I'm not sure how long I stood there, shaking with my hand no more than 3 inches away, before I saw the flashlights of my friends at the end of the hallway, and at last, I could do it. I wrenched the door open and immediately went outside, hyperventilating with panic. My friends soon joined me, also saying something felt a little weird in there that time. We were gathering outside the door when the friend with the breathing issues felt something on her shoulder. We pulled down her shirt and there was a noticeable, quite obvious handprint. Nobody touched her, especially not hard enough to leave a full handprint through clothing. We've been back several times and haven't had another experience in any way, which only makes it even more odd, if you ask me. So much can happen in the forest. There are wild animals, possibly bad people, and the unknown itself. While hiking in Switzerland, I decided to see Matterhorn, the famous mountain, up close. As close as I could. So I left the village I was staying in early and walked through meadows, hills, and then up the mountains to reach the plateau. Early in the morning, after just leaving the town, I walked the straight path, past some houses on the left, town behind, mountain ahead, and forest on the right. In front of the forest, there were a few curious old huts on long legs, ones that you climb up to by ladder. They were all made of round planks and black soot. My imagination immediately called them witch huts, relating them to movies and legends that I knew. They seemed closed, and I couldn't get into any of them, but I felt a slight shiver of excitement, and didn't really want to get in. So I kept on walking. I saw the mountain, met some people, had lunch, and in the afternoon decided to walk back to town. I remembered the way and backtracked pretty much exactly. On my way back, the mountain was behind me, the town ahead, houses and meadows on the right, and black spooky huts on the left, guiding the entrance, a path leading into the forest. I should note that despite checking out the huts in the morning, I didn't notice that there was a forest path starting behind them. Curious about it, I checked the wooden road signs placed in the vicinity of the huts. To my surprise, the one pointing into the woods said Zermatt, but the one pointing to where I originally came from in the morning said some other town's name. I was very confused. I looked back and looked again, thinking that maybe my brain was tricking me, but I kept seeing what I saw. I stood there while a few hikers passed in each direction. All stayed on the mountain path, nobody went into the forest or looked at the road signs. I sat there in front of the huts and smoked a cigarette. I debated whether or not I should go into the forest, why the signs showed such weird directions. I wondered if there was a reason I should go in. But I was already very tired to the point of my legs feeling weak. So I decided to go back the way I came, to trust my gut and take the most common main path back to town. When I stood up, the signs were different again. There was no way anyone could have rearranged them. No wind or human. I was there the whole time, and the only people who walked by didn't stop at the signs, let alone tinker with them. The one pointing into the forest said some other name, and the one pointing to my starting point said Zermatt like it should. I told this story to my friend in Zermatt, and he just laughed at the idea of paranormal entities trying to lure me into the forest. I did have a creepy feeling about the huts, but at the same time it was a beautiful day, and I still wonder whether there was some